Hello and welcome everyone to the return, the long-awaited and hopefully long-anticipated return of orthodoxy, autocracy and nationality. I'm very lucky to be joined by Marcus Furius Pertinax. Hello.
Hello, good morning, everyone. It's lovely to be back, and nice that we can finally bookend this wonderful and enduring series.
Yes, just to add on to that point regarding the finale of this series, there are going to be two finale episodes because this is a series regarding the Orthodox Commonwealth. And so, therefore, it only makes sense that we talk about the conclusion to the story about Greece and Constantinople, and by extension, the whole Anatolian question, the Greek East. And this will be followed up by a conversation on the fall of the Third Rome, which is the fall to Bolshevism. Now, to try and explain why this episode has been so long in coming, I really want to sort of go into the whole sort of mental process regarding these streams. Originally, I had planned for more streams regarding this topic. Nevertheless, I felt narratively in the whole scheme of orthodoxy, autocracy, and nationality, I couldn't really fit these smaller streams in because the consistent thread throughout the history of the Balkans in the 19th century vis-a-vis the Turks is that of what I believe a Greco-Turkish 100 Years' War, which is the supplemental title to the false dawn of Greater Greece, focusing from the Greek plan up into the failure of the Megali idea. Originally, I thought about calling this stream simply the Balkan Wars. At other times, I thought the springtime of the Balkans or the false spring of the Balkans. There was another title regarding the race to Constantinople or Constantinople denied, or any such extension of this idea of the conflagration of the Balkans, the dissolution of the Ottoman Empire to be replaced by something else on all fronts, whether it be the Turkish Republic from the perspective of Anatolia, all these various, we're talking about literal Balkanization in terms of this process of the disintegration of a political authority within the context of the Balkans. So I think it's necessary to talk about historical invention and historical narratives here because there is this sort of tried and true proverb regarding history in which, in contrast to writing fiction, a writer sins if he does not invent, but for a historian, he sins if he does invent. And this isn't really true because a historian has to conceptualize a series of disparate events, conceive of certain events as historically relevant and other events as historically irrelevant. And it is the process of selection and narrative construction that distinguishes a historian from someone who simply compiles information like an antiquarian, or someone who prides themselves in knowing more and more about less and less, what a Schiller would call a dry as dust historian, which isn't really a historian at all. So I'm going to be referencing a lot of precedents within the course of this series over several hundred years, to my mind, going all the way back to the 13th and the 14th century, and even further back, talking about the return to Hellas, the return to a Greece confined to Attica and the Thessaly, the Peloponnese and the region around Athens, and of course the Greek islands. All of these things are relevant here. And of course, when we're trying to conceive of this idea of narrative construction and historical invention, bear in mind that Byzantium is an undercurrent throughout all of these conversations in both the Greek context, the Ottoman context, and of course, even the Russian context when we look at Moscow as the Third Rome. So it is important to consider that Byzantium, this consistent thread that distinguishes the East from the Western Roman Empire, is itself a historical invention which only arises out of the demise of the quote-unquote Byzantine Empire, or the Romaioi state, the Empire of the Romans. No one living in Constantinople in 1453 considered him or herself to be a resident of a Byzantine empire, they would think of themselves as Christians, as Romans, and possibly even as Greeks. These were all appellations that were thrown about. So I'm trying to conceive the course of the 19th century in some form of consistent narrative, because Greece is a consistent thread, yet at the same time it doesn't appear as an obvious protagonist of the 19th century vis-a-vis the dissolution of the Ottoman Empire. Sometimes the Russian Empire appears like a protagonist. Sometimes it is the offshoot of the interventions of the Russian Empire, which is the state of Bulgaria. And then all of a sudden, Bulgaria takes a dramatic about turn, and all of a sudden, where it began with Greece, it ends with Greece, which is why it's been so difficult to conceptualize this in terms of a consistent narrative arc throughout the whole 19th century. And this is why I think dwelling on this idea of a Greco-Turkish 100 Years' War, it isn't something that I'm sure there is probably some historian, maybe not even in English, who has quoted this idea of the Greco-Turkish 100 Years' War, because I think there is a lot of merit to that terminology. When we look at 1821, when Ypsilantis crosses the Pruth, to the armistice of Modena and later the Treaty of Lucerne, not only does it span roughly a period of almost exactly 100 years, 1821 until 1922, 1923, but in 1821, the Greek Revolution heralds the end of something, the beginning of the end, which is that of the nation of Rome, the Militarum, the Eastern Roman Empire within the context of the Ottoman Empire. It begins with a Greek revolution, a Greek rebellion, and you can say, it's almost like an act of ethnic betrayal from the perspective of the Ottomans, Turks, where you see a process of pogroms committed against the Greek populations throughout the Ottoman Empire, and a systematic execution of the Greek ethnarchs, hierarchs, and also the disempowerment of a Greek elite strata within the Ottoman Empire, the Phanariotes. So from the beginning, from 1821, we see the division within the Ottoman Empire between Greeks within a Greek national state, which from the beginning does not consist of all Greeks, far from it. And then towards the end of this period, 1922, 1923, we see the culmination of this, which is the population transfers, which definitively ends this link, this enmeshing of populations and histories between the Greeks and the Turks, which is very much the case really since the 14th century, when the Ottomans crossed over Gallipoli and entered and thundered, you can say, literally, when we look at people like Bayezid Yildirim coming into the Balkans and establishing a Turkish presence, which in many ways exists to this day. So it is within this context that I conceive of this period as a Greco-Turkish 100 Years' War. But I think if we're drawing a direct comparison to the actual 100 Years' War, it is also important to note that the 100 Years' War begins with a French elite, or at least a Norman elite in Britain, with various dynastic vestiges within France. The idea of an English nation does not quite fit into the context of the early 14th century. But by the 15th century, when we have the conclusion of the 100 Years' War in 1453 or possibly 1475, depending on where you're going to strictly delineate this line, then we are left with a French nation and an English nation, really for the first time, in which the king himself will actually speak English. Whereas in this context, we are seeing the true creation of a Greek nation and the true creation of a Turkish nation, of the ruin of the Ottoman Empire, the final ruin of the Ottoman Empire. And so in that context, I think the reference of the 100 Years' War is a very pertinent one in terms of this conversation. But of course, it's not just pertinent in the sense of the creation of these two nations and the duration of the conflict and the piecemeal nature of the conflict, how it goes into abeyance for long, protracted periods of time, only to heat up at certain points. It is also the dream, like from the perspective of the English, of a greater Greece denied, the false dawn of Greater Greece, and the aspirations of the Greek population to see the restitution of Anatolian territories, European territories, and pivotally, the reconquest of Constantinople. In the context of the Greek psyche, you can say that the loss of Constantinople in 1453 is equivalent to, if not greater, than the loss of Paris would be to the French in terms of the seismic sort of diminishing of this concept of Greece vis-a-vis the Turks and the Ottomans. I appreciate, Marcus, that I've gone on quite a long tangent regarding this, but just before we delve deeper into the information, do you think there is any merit in some of the suggestions which I brought up here?
Well, absolutely, and just for the benefit of the audience too, I will also say that this series could have actually gone on rather more extensively and in greater detail. And I suppose to some degree, it could be argued that we could have got a bit lost in the weeds. As you say, when we started, we've returned to finish, orthodoxy, autocracy, and nationalism. But there is even perspectives there where themes that you've run with in this series, I myself, as a self-described or certainly an avowed Byzantist, never would have adopted myself, and that is the idea that to an extent within the millet room, the Romai who live under the Ottoman Sultanate is sort of an extension of this sort of Greek-Roman realm. Obviously, the Byzantine Empire itself is extinguished. You might say technically in 1453, but ostensibly in 1461. With the fall of Trebizond and the Morea.
Well, just
And
to
and
just to
sorry,
contextualize this within the just to contextualize this within
no,
the
of course.
grand scheme of this series with Russia as well.
Hmm. Hmm.
It is this idea in the Orthodox community, as well as the idea of Caesar-papism in the West, who is truly the leader of this commonwealth. Is it the emperor or is it the patriarch? There was a conflict in Russia regarding this. Indeed, during the early Romanov period, the patriarch Philaret arguably had more authority than the Tsar Mikhail, in the same way that you can say for a brief period Nikon was really determining the affairs of the Muscovite Tsardom or the Russian Empire, rather than
Hmm.
that of the Tsar Alexis. So in this context, you can say that we're wrestling with the idea of who is the true leader. Is it the ecumenical patriarch or is it the emperor? And in this case, a part of the mythology of the Third Rome is this idea that John the Eighth and later Constantine the 11th had broken with this tradition of orthodoxy, in that they had agreed to the stipulations of the Council of Florence. They had surrendered this idea of the independence of the Orthodox Church vis-a-vis Rome. And when Gennadius accepted that mantle of the ethnarch of the Roman nation in the context of the Ottomans from Mehmed II, you can say he considered it very much as a restoration of that Orthodox authority under the headship of the ecumenical patriarch. And so what we're really delineating here is the terminus of this idea, the literal Balkanization of this region, and the creation of all of these nations in this territory, and this race to Constantinople, which ultimately doesn't amount to anything. And on all fronts, we see the decimation of this idea of the nation of Rome.
Well, indeed, and just to buttress that last point, I mean, it's probably unfair to say, how you just put it just now about it not coming to pass, about Constantinople.
Well, yes, I'm just in terms of this race for Constantinople.
So
This is
yes, thank you. No, I was just waiting for the way you phrase it, the race for Constantinople. In truth, there's a window in which this actually occurs, but as soon as you might say the Greeks and the well, I would say the Orthodox, but obviously the Russian state has fallen to the revolution at this point. But insofar that the West, you might say, and all the Greeks have Constantinople in its hands, it drops that orb within 2 years of having possession of it. This gambit to impose upon the Turks the initial treaty from the end of World War I, Treaty of Sevres, it unravels, the Greeks gamble everything and ultimately lose. And it's actually there's great tragic consequences for it, because what we see is this transformation of Anatolia as a geographical landmass, and obviously by extension that Eastern Thrace, the European, what we call European Turkey today, um, rather than being this place where Turks obviously arrived in the 11th century, and in subsequent times have coexisted alongside groups of Armenians and Greeks and Bulgars, particularly on the European side. Turkey becomes an ethno-state. Minorities are expelled from Anatolia. There are massacres that occur within Anatolia as well, before and during and in the aftermath of this campaign. And people whom had called those lands, whether it's Pontus, whether it's Ionia, whether it's Cappadocia, whether it's Phrygia, whether it's Lycia or Caria, these places where, and of course, obviously in Constantinople and in Eastern Thrace, these people who'd called those lands their homeland and had been the homeland of their predecessors for 2 millennia more in some cases, are expelled and permanently divorced from their homeland. And that is a tragic story. It's actually probably the most tragic aspect of this end point of this story.
Well, again, to look at this within the broad sweep of this narrative, what you're describing is the reversal of the process of Greek colonia, which had been established during the classical period and even before. I mean, really, in terms of the contraction of this idea of the Greek population, we're almost looking at the archaic period in Greek history. It really is
Absolutely.
quite astounding. And this, again, why I'm interested in ending it at this point in 1922, 1923, this idea that we are almost returning to Greece as it was at its lowest ebb before its golden age. And alas,
Exactly.
there hasn't been a golden age to subsequently replace it. In fact,
Mm.
Greece has been a strategic consideration for other powers less than a sovereign power or a great cultural power in its own
Mm.
right. So I'd
In
like,
some
yeah.
ways, also, sorry if I may just say quickly, just two quick points, is that in one sense too, you might say that as much as with the foundation of the modern Greek state in the aftermath of the Greek War of Independence, from the early 1800s, there was this notion, because much of the Enlightenment obviously rejected the profound religious hostility of the Orthodox Greeks, and tried to sort of found or in the foundation of the Greek state, tried to sort of do so in the image of a classical Greece, an ancient Greece, rather than as sort of like a reemergence of Byzantium and the Eastern Empire, as this sort of intermingling of the Greek Orthodox tradition as we would understand it more from the Middle Ages and onwards. And that the modern Greek state is actually more reflective of that archaic Greek state, as you've mentioned. And the second thing is, just very briefly, is that it's funny that the great one of the hilarious, or not hilarious, but one of the funny things that sort of crops up in history is the idea that many powers over history, particularly since the fall of Rome, have referred to Italy as being not a people, not a country, but a geographical expression. And arguably that's probably more true of Greece. Subsequent to this period, it becomes almost like this pawn on the chessboard for others, and the Greeks themselves don't have a preeminent place, which, when you consider the immense legacy and the storied history of the Greek peoples and the Greek, well, I suppose, nation in the modern context, it's quite a sad tragedy to have seen you know that befall Greece as a whole. I think that ultimately is a sad footnote in this
Well,
story
no,
too.
I think it's actually a brilliant segue into what I wanted to talk about, because my controversial opinion is that the last time the Greeks had significant European influence was during the 18th century as part of this elite strata within the context of the Ottoman Empire, which at this point wasn't dying, which is why when Mehmed II was informed of the revolution throughout the Balkans, throughout the Militarum, they responded as if this had been a collective national betrayal by the Greeks. And I still, again, look at organizations like the Philiki Eteria and believe they were misinformed and horrifically misguided in this context. And of course, there is an aspect of that classicism running through this, the idea that these are the descendants of the French Revolution, and they're wanting to divorce this idea of Greece from Byzantium, as you mentioned. They're wanting to return to this neoclassical conception, this post-religious conception, because within the context of this Greek elite, the Phanariotes, the Greeks who are ruling over the Danubian principalities, what is now Romania, Moldavia, and Wallachia, in order to create this new enlightened Greece, which is following in the footsteps of the French Revolution, one needs to disassociate it from this orthodox religious identity, create a secular identity. And who is the leader of the Greek nation in the sense? It is the ecumenical patriarch. So one needs to dethrone the ecumenical patriarch in order to bring about Hellas, this Hellenic state within the context of the Balkans. But nevertheless, you can say the balls on the original revolutionaries is that they did not think of this Greek state within the context of its current borders or even the borders of the Megali idea. It is within the context of the entirety of the Balkans that you see on the right, that all of these territories collectively could have formed part of a Hellenic state, even though ethnically these groups are very disparate regarding all the Slavs, Albanians, Bosniaks, etc., and indeed
Indeed.
Turks. So the interesting
Well,
thing
just to
is,
reinforce your point briefly, if I may, the initial revolt of the Filiki Eteria actually occurs on the north side of the Danube River. It actually occurs
again,
in the principalities, which is
the,
the great irony that a lot of people don't know about.
Well, again, that's the voyage of Ypsilantis across the Pruth.
Exactly, yes.
And of course, the irony is Ypsilantis thought of himself as the Greek George Washington crossing the Potomac, or even Caesar crossing the Rubicon. And of course, Ypsilantis's revolution was over before it began. And the Greek Revolution would be led by other figures, which is, you can say, why this whole concept was doomed from the very start, because it was built on the idea of a false premise that Alexander I of Russia would come in, support the Greek population, and that the Turks would not respond in the horrific way that they did, responding to this idea of an ethnic betrayal. But I want to bring this up within the context of the Megali idea and contrast this, because you can say the Megali idea was the original idea behind the Greek Revolution. This idea that we are not a small Greece, we are a greater Greece. We are a Greece of great power status. We will take Constantinople, we will take the Balkans, and we will lead it as this elite strata over a multi-ethnic empire. This is the same thinking that underpinned Catherine the Great's Greek plan. This idea that the Russian Empire, expanding into the Crimea, expanding into the Taurida, crossing over the Danube River into the Balkans, would herald the final dissolution of an Ottoman authority over its Orthodox population, and that the second grandson of Catherine, of course named Constantine for obvious reasons, would be given the mantle of this headship of a Greek empire, or the restitution of a Byzantine empire. So before we see the fragmentation of this Greek-led state within Ottoman Europe, this is very much the thinking. The Megali idea is ever present. So when we see the Megali idea in its iteration in 1922, for example, it is a lesser Megali idea, ironically, in terms of the literal meaning of what this means, the idea of a greater Greece, because it is stemming from this idea that original Greece has fallen, the nation of Rome has fallen, the idea of some sort of neoclassical subversion of a explicitly orthodox identity has failed, and we have been left with this territory in the dark blue here. So even when looking, say, for example, at Venizelos here and his designs for a greater Greece, which is far more based on ethnicity rather than religion here, this map you can see of Western Anatolia, Constantinople, Thrace, Macedonia, all of these Crete, Rhodes, all of these areas reintegrated into a larger Greek state or a greater Greece, they pale in contrast to this original Megali idea emanating from the intentions of the original revolution. And even on this map, you don't really see it. But there is this idea also of integrating the Danubian principalities, because throughout the 18th century, who were the hospodars or the vassals, the princes of the Danubian principalities? They weren't ethnic Romanians, they were ethnic Greeks.
Correct, yeah.
So ironically, the Megali idea is a lesser idea. And this is why, when we look at this idea of Greater Greece, the original Greater Greece denied was in 1821. And we are talking here about the second Greece denied, the Commiseration Prize. And even for the Greeks, that was not to be either. I understand that we've talked about this period of Balkan history quite a lot in previous episodes. So just to contextualize for people who may not have seen the previous episodes, if you want to learn more about the Crimean War, there is a dedicated episode on that. Of course, there is a dedicated episode on the Greek War of Independence. There is also an episode from the Ottoman perspective, more or less focusing on Abdul Hamid and the turn to Islam in the latter period of the Ottoman Empire, really coming up to the Young Turk Revolution in 1908 and later, of course, in 1913. So we are taking this history and we are approaching it from a different perspective. And just looking at the enlargement of Greece, you can see here on this map, which is bringing in Alexander II and his role in the history of this territory. Greece remains stuck in this territory for a very long time, whilst the rest of the Balkans is beginning to unravel and break away from the Ottoman Empire. And when we look at, say, for example, something like the Crimean War, I think I refer to this period as almost the second Crimean War, because the first Crimean War was between 1768 and 1774, when the Ottoman Empire was defeated. The Russians established a protectorate over Crimea, after which they would later annex it as part of Russia, which has again recently been annexed today. So this was Russia triumphant in this first Crimean War. Gregory Orlov, of course, built the Russian Navy along with Potemkin, travels into the Aegean and tries to foment the original Greek revolt in the 1760s and the 1770s. In other words, there is this alliance, this natural alliance between the Greeks and the Russians against the Ottomans. In 1768 until 1774, this does not come to pass. But when we come to the second Crimean War, again, appreciate that I'm using my own historical terminology, but I have to, because history is a process of invention, and I'm thinking of parallels and long thematic arcs throughout the history of the period. So to look at this first Crimean War and to look at the second Crimean War, they're obvious parallels. And this is the fact that there is a Ottoman state, which is opposed to Russia, fighting over the fate of Crimea, while the Greeks are desperate to come into the fight on the side of the Russians. But the tragedy of the Greek Revolution is that the first Greek state, following the death of Capodistrias, who of course was a Russian civil servant before he became the head of state of Greece, is that Greece is ultimately not a sovereign nation. It is a puppet which, after the Russians have been kept out of the Aegean, is controlled by the French and the British. And so the French and the British will not allow a Greek revolution to extend further throughout the Ottoman Empire. They want to retain the Ottoman Empire, Empire's territory as is. And you can say, limit the extension of Greek territory into the rest of the Ottoman Empire. So whereas the first,
may I
sorry, so
interject
I'll
briefly?
just finish this point.
Okay,
So
sure,
whereas
sure.
the first Crimean War was a triumph of Russia, and you can say the prelude to the Greek Revolution, the second Crimean War represented the opposite. But yes, go on with your point, Marcus.
No, indeed, because you just mentioned Ioannis Kapodistrias, and it's important to just touch on him very slightly, just in this context that, you know, when a sort of, in this instance where sort of Greece as a nation, or the Greek people sort of regain a degree of, you know, self-sovereignty, which they have not had for, you could almost say, the better part of half a millennia at this point, by the time they gained independence in, you know, the 1820s, that, or 1830s, 1820s, 1830s, that had he survived, because it's worth noting that Capodistrias is actually killed amongst the spat amongst the Greek elite, and he's actually shot outside of a church when he's leaving liturgy. And then there's this sort of interfighting between many of the leaders of the Greek Revolution, and that Capodistrias was probably the one man who could have established some degree of maybe not as in the context of a king or anything, but as a political leader for Greece, and probably could have steered the Greek state in possibly a different direction. But without unified leadership of the Greek state, Greece was liable to be this, like you say, almost vassal that is shared between France and Britain, and therefore its aspirations are very much contained within this territory, which you see remain constant up until essentially the end of the 1800s.
Well, just to build on this point, what I find to be the tragedy of the Greek Revolution is that you take the Phanariotes, you take the Ecumenical Patriarch, you take the Hospodars, you take a firmly established Greek elite, which is basically second to nothing more than the Ottoman Sultan himself. Because remember, before the 19th century, the Ottomans were in no way consciously Turkish. In no way. They were caliphs, they were padishahs, they were Caesars. They ruled over a multi-ethnic, multi-religious empire,
You could
and
call them Islamic Caesars in a sense.
they relied exactly, and they
Mm.
even less than Islamic Caesars, because they tolerated Orthodox nations existing
Indeed.
under their
Yes.
aegis.
Indeed.
So the Ottoman Empire considers the Greeks to be their most prominent vassal client ethnicity within the context of this multi-ethnic empire. And the tragedy of the Greek Revolution is that you begin this, and then at the end of the Greek Revolution, what are you left with? You're left with the extension of the guerrilla conflicts, the maniots, the blood feuds, which had characterized the history of the Peloponnese for hundreds of years up until this point. So Greater Greece is left with this legacy of the parochial struggles of the population of Attica and the Peloponnese. This territory, of course, had not received investment from the Ottoman Empire. It was one of the most backward states within the context of the entire Ottoman Empire. And it is this nucleus, which just so happened to coincide with ancient Hellas, which becomes the basis, the foundation of a later Greek state. So it is founded, you can say, on this denied potential of this idea of the Greater Greece. And even when we look at the first head of state after Capodistrias, who you mentioned, was one of the few figures who could have possibly wrestled Greece out of this parochial nightmare. Instead, we have the importation of a foreign monarch in the case of Otto of the House of Wittelsbach, and later, of course, George of the House of Glucksburg, of course, emanating from Denmark. So Greece, therefore, is a product more of the interventions of foreign powers, and it is within the straitjacket of foreign power politics that it will persist throughout, you can say, the entirety of this period, from 1821 up until 1922, 1923. When Alexander II wins the Russo-Turkish War of 1877-1878, this is the moment where a Bulgarian state finally achieves independence after 400 years of Ottoman control over this region. Now, what is interesting about this period is that it actually seems throughout the remainder of the 19th century that it is Bulgaria which is now going to become the protagonist after the denied potential of the original Greek Revolution, which I find fascinating. And this is also a point to bring up this process of fragmentation. So even though, as a result of Benjamin Disraeli, the British Prime Minister's very adroit politicking to retain territories of the Ottoman Empire within Europe, as you see on this map in 1878, the process of fragmentation is well underway. Of course, Greece wasn't the first independent state in the Balkans vis-a-vis the Ottoman Empire. The first was Montenegro. The first real shock to the Ottoman Empire was in Serbia, which again is less related to the ideas of the French Enlightenment and the Philiki Italia, as with the case of the Greek Independence War. But this is actually, you can say, a local struggle regarding the various patronage groups, the Janissaries, who were living in the Serbian Empire at this time, and only later does it adopt the air of a nationalistic struggle in the 1840s and finally to be recognized during this period as an independent state away from the Sublime Porte or the court of the Ottoman Empire. So I talked at the beginning about this idea of the ecumenical patriarch representing this authority of the Roman nation under the aegis of the Ottoman Sultan. This process of the creation of these new states in the Balkans has the effect also of creating autocephalous churches. For people who don't understand, autocephalous literally means self-governing head within Greek. This idea that it is not enough to become independent from the Ottoman Empire, one needs to become independent from the ecumenical patriarch, representing that continuity of Gennadius and the Byzantine Empire, which preceded the Ottoman conquest in 1453. So,
Can I
yeah.
just come in there for a sec? I was just going to say, just for the sake of etymology, autocephalos, the the Greek word for head is kephale. So autokephale, make of it what you will, or self-governing, self-headed authority. That's just the meaning of the word in Greek. Sorry, continue. AM.
Yeah. So just to give a catalogue of this process of balkanization and autocephaly. So Romania is the key point of contention within the Crimean War. The fate of Romania, is it going to be an extension of the Russian Empire, or are the Ottomans going to be able to wrestle some authority over it to keep the Russians out of the Balkans? That isn't the case. Instead, we see the union of Wallachia and Moldavia, and that'll become the nucleus for a new Romanian state. And this also coincides with the Romanian autocephaly, which creates the Romanian Orthodox Church. In the 1880s, Romania will become a nation, adopting, again, you can say even the name Romania, rather than adopting the name of Greater Wallachia or something, or their colloquial description of Lax, which persisted throughout the medieval period. Even the etymology of Romania is, you can say, a direct imitation or direct attack on this idea of the Roman patronage of the Ottoman sultans up until this point, which is an interesting point to note. But Romania, of course, is one of these nations which is carved out, ironically, not originally conceived of to the detriment of the Ottoman Empire, but in the long term, it is to the detriment of the Ottoman Empire when we get to the First Balkan War. Of course, we now come to Bulgaria. Bulgaria is in this awkward status after 1878, where the Russians had been desperate to create a greater Bulgaria. They had wanted Bulgaria to have as much territory as possible, conceived of as a Russian vassal state. Bulgaria would then have access to the Mediterranean in Thrace, a huge swath of territory in Macedonia, possibly even linking up to Greece, which could have possibly flipped and joined in with the Russians again, as had been the intention of Tsar Nicholas in 1827, 1828, when he had partaken of the Greek War of Independence. Instead, again, because of Disraeli's Eduard politicking, this is not the case. Bulgaria is left in this awkward situation where there is a Turkish Bulgaria and there is a remnant Principality of Bulgaria, which is left in the north. And someone has mentioned in the chat, Ioannis has mentioned in the chat, that this is the distinction between the original Treaty of San Stefano and the Treaty of Berlin in 1878. The other power, of course, is Serbia. Serbia, which again is finally recognized at this point and has this rump territory. But the interesting thing about Serbia is that Serbia is not really a factor in the Ottoman Empire here. Instead, Serbia's destiny is directed towards Bosnia, directed towards Bulgaria in terms of an adversarial relationship, even directed towards Albania, but of course noticeably directed against the Austrian Empire after the regicide of 1902. So Serbia is not going to feature prominently in this conversation. And this is also, I think, a good point to bring in another comparison, which I think is actually quite pertinent, which is this idea of the original dissolution of the Byzantine Empire following the Fourth Crusade, the sack of Constantinople in 1204. Because what is the political situation following the sack of Constantinople? You have a foreign religion, Catholicism, which has been imposed on the Greek population. You have a foreign dynasty in form of the Latin emperors controlling Constantinople itself. And then you have these fragmented Latin, later ethnically Italian principalities controlling areas of Greece. And then, of course, Venice becomes the most enduring power to hold territories in Greece, lasting up until the 1660s and the loss of Candia, which is the possession of Crete within the context of
Yeah.
the Stato di Mar, the nation of the sea, the empire of the sea.
Which is notwithstanding the brief occupation of the Morea, by the way.
Yes. Well, the brief yes, the brief occupation of the Morea, I
Mm,
believe, was in the first couple of decades in the 18th century, but
yes,
it didn't last very long.
exactly.
I think the loss of Crete is more dramatic, you can
Oh,
say,
no, it
but
certainly is. And you might say that there's in the place that you mentioned, particularly in Crete, there's actually this evidence even today of this of a cultural sort of diffusion, almost a fusion between the Venetian overlords and the Greeks of today. Like even if you go to um, local, uh, particularly in the New World, like the Americas or Australia or whatever. You go to like a local Greek center, and if you watch Creations dance and the music they listen to, it actually very much coincides with Venetian cues. That's all I wanted to say.
no, I think that is a pertinent point to say. But more than the Francocratia, I look at this again as a precedent of this rush to Constantinople, which we're bringing up again here, the disillusion of the quote unquote Roman state within the Balkans, and the possibility that any of these new states, which are popping out from the ruin of the Ottoman Empire in the Balkans, could have wrestled this idea of taking over Constantinople and then, by extension, headship over the entirety of the Balkans. When looking at the 13th and the 14th century, because the Francocratia was always weak to begin with, it was simply a question which power is going to take over. Is it the Asen dynasty, the second Bulgarian empire? Is it going to be the nascent Serbian state? Is it going to be one of these Latin principalities like the Despotate of Epirus or the Empire of Thessaloniki? Instead, against sort of all expectations, it is the Empire of Nicaea, and after the usurpation of the Lascaris dynasty, it is the Paleologos dynasty that takes over and forms the most enduring but most pathetic iteration of the Byzantine Empire. So throughout the 14th century, it then becomes a question who is going to take over the mantle of the Byzantine Empire, when after the first few decades of the 14th century, it is very clear they are not strong enough to hold the state together as it existed before the Fourth Crusade. So after Bulgaria, you can say has its opportunity in the 13th century, fails. Then you come up to Serbia. Serbia, which in the latter half of the 14th century looks to be, you can say, the true inheritor of this Roman legacy. Um, when it controls a huge swath of Macedonia, it's directed southward into the Balkans, it makes various Greek principalities into vassal states. But of course, all of these are false starts. All of these race to Constantinople, but they fail to achieve any lasting results. Albania collapses, the Francocratia, the Latin Empire collapses, Serbia collapses. And who is the state which ultimately wins the race for Constantinople, despite all of the foreign interventions, the Crusades, which are assembled to stop it? It, of course, is the Ottoman Empire. So bear this in mind. We're talking about foreign interventions, Balkanization, the original Balkanization in the 13th and the 14th centuries, the carving out of various empires and states within this region. And then we see the Turks coming in, definitively solving the question and establishing Constantinople as an extension of a Turkic empire. And this happens twice, again, in terms of looking at historical comparisons. And of course, even looking to something as specific as autocephaly, looking at the creation of a Romanian church, of a Bulgarian church, of a Serbian metropolitan state, which later becomes a Serbian patriarchate. It's even important to consider that the Austrians got in on this game, and they created an independent autocephalous church within Serbia, Slavonia, essentially the region which formed part of the Austrian military frontier. Within the context of the 14th and the 13th century, Serbia asserts its religious independence and creates the first Serbian patriarchate as well. So I find it interesting bringing in all of these connections and how the Byzantine Empire tried to save itself during this period. In the same way that you can say, Marcus, that the Council of Florence and this attempt to meld together the Orthodox establishment and the Catholic establishment to save the empire before its dissolution. In many ways, you can say this was imitated within the Ottoman Empire when they tried to westernize, they tried to make the Ottoman Empire like the various empires of the West, indeed to receiving its capital and its economy being dependent on these Western empires at the same time. And of course, it is only half successful. And this also creates a backlash, which precipitates various revolutions in the Ottoman Empire as well. So as the Francocratia is fundamentally weak, and the attempts of a union between the churches also fails. Ottomanism within the Ottoman Empire, this attempt to create this alliance of the various ethnic groups in service to the Ottoman Sultan after the dissolving of the Janissaries, after the Greek Revolution. Ultimately, it is a belated effort, it is a weak effort, and despite the appeals of the Ottomanists, or the original Young Turks before they became Turkish nationalists, to democracy, constitutional monarchy, all of these things, it is too little, too late. Tanzimat ultimately does not result in this revitalization of the Ottoman Empire as they hope, the reincorporation of these territories. And so 1878 represents the continual disintegration of these territories. But this is, I think, a good point to come back to Greece, because as you can see here, Greece does not gain any territories really from 1832 up until 1878. Greece instead only gains territories piecemeal, as an extension, you can say, of this overall dissolution of Ottoman power in the Balkans. So, Marcus, a couple of years after the Treaty of Berlin, the Greeks occupy Thrace, I believe. In 1896, 1897, there is the Cretan situation. Just because I'm, again, conscious of the fact that I'm rambling, is there anything you want to bring up about Crete becoming part of Greece?
Aside from the fact, actually read my mind, because what I was going to say is there's a history of ramblings in Crete. In fact, Crete happens to be this epicenter of revolt in the Ottoman Empire, and it's one of those places that the Ottomans, although they do subdue it, and each time Crete is suppressed, it's done so under very harsh terms. I think on a stream we spoke about the revolt of John the Teacher, or Ioannis, what's his name? Disciatos, I think his surname is John the Teacher, where he's skinned alive in Carnia, in I can't remember if it's Heraklion or Kiana, which are the cities, but the Turks have this persistent problem with Greece, with Crete rather, and but you point out quite rightly that the Greek state itself doesn't actually really expand so much, and whether it's got to do with the fact that the French and the British particularly have this policy of trying to buttress the Ottoman Empire, not have it disintegrate. You might say maintain that balance of power post Napoleon. But I think you see on that the previous map you had of the Balkans, with the two dates, 1848, 1856 and 1878. You can see that once the Moldavia and Wallachia are sort of unified into the Romanian state, and Bulgaria is breaking away, and Bosnia is not, as we know, as we've covered several times, Bosnia is not annexed till 1908, but it's essentially occupied by Austria. You see this sort of gradual disintegration and erosion in the Balkans. Hence, there's that old saying about the Ottoman Empire being the sick man of Europe. But of course, at this point, actually, I don't think it was Thrace. I think the province you might have meant was Thessaly. I think Thessaly's
I
the
said
part
Thessaly, didn't I?
I thought you said Thrace.
If not, I meant to say Thessaly. As you
Okay,
can see
yeah,
on this map,
I figured you meant that. Yes,
yes, it's the
yeah.
light
So
blue you can see on this
yeah,
map.
so that acquisition there in 1881 is basically the first portion of Greece that they incorporate into the country, aside from that initial revolt and how can I state it? The reemergence of Greek nationhood in 1832. Although there is this instance you can see here. There's in the light blue. There's the Ionian Islands ceded by Britain in 1864.
Yeah,
That's a small point.
I just quickly mention that.
Okay, yeah.
The Ionian Islands and Corfu are an interesting case in the fact that they remained part of Venice all the way up until 1797. Again, just to really make my comments about Venice and the Francocratia precise. In other
Mm,
words, you can say the Francocratia persisted all the way up until the invasion of Italy by Napoleon, which is an interesting point to consider. But this
indeed.
territory was briefly occupied by the French. It was actually briefly occupied by the Russians, and then it was ultimately occupied by the British. I mean, it was the
Mm,
Peninsular Republic, the Republic of the Seven Islands, and then ultimately it becomes the Ionian Protectorate under Britain. And this is ceded as a gesture of goodwill by the British government to Greece. Again, it's this pathetic territorial consideration. And regarding Britain's posture towards Greece, it's important to come back to Crete again, because we have the Cretan revolt in 1896, 1897. And of course, what do the great powers do? They do not support Greek claims to Crete. Instead, as you can see on this map, Crete remains de jure part of the Ottoman Empire. And someone has already mentioned this in the chat, but again, following on from the angle of what's Britain's point of view here. Britain is interested in maintaining the Ottoman Empire as a bulwark against the Russians from entering into the Mediterranean. Greece is unreliable at this point. Greece is only begrudgingly forced into this straitjacket because of the intervention of foreign powers. But as you can see, Greece wants the restitution of these territories, the beginnings of this idea of the Megali idea. Britain also wants to establish a permanent presence within the Eastern Mediterranean. So as a result of the Treaty of Paris, there are British concessions which are established in Cyprus for the first time, as an extension of British control, which is now being established in the 1880s over Egypt, which is still technically an Ottoman province, but all pretense at it being an Ottoman province had really been unraveled under Muhammad Ali, and now this territory is under the possession of the British Empire. In other words, up until the switch of alliances in which the Ottomans become entrenched in the German camp, Britain was very much the international backer of the Ottoman Empire, and a persistent Ottoman Empire. So you can say that they would prefer a weak Crete, a Crete which is under the control of the Ottomans, which isn't part of the aspirations of a new Greek state. And you can even say that the British would have actually preferred an independent Crete state, which would have been controlled by extension by the British. And this is just another series of denied expectations of the Greek Empire, and why looking at this as a Greco-Turkish war is in some aspects problematic, and why I have such difficulty in terms of talking about a consistent thread is because Greece seems such an impotent actor throughout this entire period. It has aspirations, but these aspirations are being continually denied. And it's only up until the beginning of the 20th century does the Ottoman Empire begin to unravel. And it doesn't unravel just because of Greek intervention, but as a result of a dramatic turnabout in terms of the alliance structure. As I mentioned, Britain eventually is no longer the main backer of the Ottoman Empire. Instead, the Germans become the principal backer of the Ottomans. Even though we have the Triple Alliance, the first major power to deal a decisive blow to the Ottomans as a result of this recontextualizing of the alliances for the Ottoman Empire is Italy. But just before I get into that, there was this last-ditched attempt by the Sultan of the Ottoman Empire, Abdul Hamid II, to maintain control over this territory that you can see on the middle map here. This territory stretching from Constantinople through to Albania. In I think it's 1905, there is an attempt to pit these various nationalities against each other. There is an Aromanian millet, or a nation of the Aromanians, which is this weird ethnicity which consists mainly around the territory of Macedonia, which doesn't have a nation state today, but there are Aromanians living in Greece, there are Aromanians living in Macedonia. This, you can say, accelerates this idea that Abdul Hamid II may in fact stay in power. There may be a vestige of Ottomanism which is successful, and so in 1908 there is a coup undertaken by elements of the Ottoman army, which overthrows Abdul Hamid II. When he tries to restore that authority, he is definitively removed and replaced by his impotent brother Mehmed. So within this context now, you can say this is the final death of Ottomanism. The Young Turks are in power, and they are going to attempt one last there is this one last attempt to keep these territories together, And instead, this is almost entirely undone by the dramatic unfolding of the Balkan Wars. The Ottoman Empire starts off this period as this great power, and by the beginning of the 20th century, it has become, as I've mentioned on a previous stream, very much so the sick man of Europe. So would you like to briefly explain to us the Italo-Turkish War, why it happened, and what ultimately were the Italian gains as a result of this conflict, very briefly?
No, indeed. Actually, to be honest with you, I haven't, I haven't sort of done notes on this per se. But in essence, what can be said is that we have the breakout of the Balkan Wars. Obviously, there's a Balkan War in 1912 and a successive conflict in 1913, and of course, in the first iteration of the Balkan War, you basically have this Balkan alliance of the
Oh, no,
Greeks.
but before we get there, we have to, of course, discuss the Italo-Turkish War.
No, 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 no.
Yeah.
I am just I am talking about context. Is that obviously there's this first Balkan War where you have this alliance of Balkan countries. You know, the Greeks, the Serbs, the Bulgarians who unite against, and the Romanians they unite against Turkey, and there's or the Ottoman Empire rather at this point, prior to becoming Turkey. And there's this fear, this very real fear of the Ottomans being sort of ganged up on in the Balkans. So the Italians, having been smarted over disagreements in North Africa with the French, because Italians had been eyeing off Tunisia, but the French sort of snatched Tunisia from underneath Italy's noses, and the Italians are still looking for colonial pursuits in Africa. At this point, the only territories they have is Eritrea, where obviously they're checked by the Ethiopians right at the end of the 19th century, and of course Italian Somalia, without the Jubaland at this point. And
Italy sort of really cuts a pathetic I mean, when we look at, say, for example, the Battle of Adwa, the reinvigorated Ethiopian state was able to win a decisive victory at a attempt of the Italians to reconquer Ethiopia, because of course when Mussolini attacks Ethiopia, it isn't the Italo-Ethiopian War, it is the second Italo-Ethiopian War.
Correct.
Just by point of clarity, 99 Joke's point, when I mention the fact that the British were effectively given control over Cyprus, de jure, it remained part of the Ottoman Empire, in the same way that Egypt was still de jure controlled by a vassal or a khedive, a viceroy of the Ottoman Empire. And you can say the ridiculousness of this situation in terms of all of these pretenses, all of these faux vassalages to the Ottoman port, the Sublime Porte, was when Britain was at war with the Ottomans in the First World War. What did the British do? They simply changed the name of the Egyptian Khedive to the Egyptian Sultan and later the Egyptian King. It really doesn't mean anything at this point. And as someone's mentioned, even to this day, the British have a significant influence and bases within the island of Cyprus. That Mediterranean vestige has continued.
They still have military assets in Cyprus. They have an air base and a naval port as well.
Exactly.
I think either side of Limassol.
Exactly.
Yeah.
So you mentioned the fact that Italy is smarting of these very defeats. In fact, there looks like there's going to be a revolution when King, I think it's Umberto the First or Umberto the Second.
Umberto the First
is assassinated. I think was it in year 1900. There looks to be like the beginnings of a anti-royalist socialist revolution, and the creation of a weak tentative democratic coalition under Vittorio Emanuele III. But Italy looks like the most inexplicable of powers to deal a decisive blow against the Ottoman Empire. But that is exactly what happens. So would you like to explain what happens with Italy?
Yeah, sure. So, like I said, I haven't actually done notes in terms of the actual basis behind the Italian declaration of war and how they set about it. What I do know is that the Italians land troops in North Africa. They land troops at Derna, at Benghazi, at Tobruk. They basically snatch the ports right from underneath the Turkish noses, because the Turks actually surprised that and you're quite right to say that Italy politically is quite unstable at this point in time, and is basically continually unstable throughout the First World War and up until Mussolini takes power in the early 20s. But that notwithstanding, the Italian state is relatively unstable, and Italian society is undergoing sort of convulsions of its own. But yet, that being said, and as is even described about Italy in the Second World War, it's like it's not a major power, it's not a regional power, it's sort of a secondary power in between. And because of that, Italy had actually built a relatively, the First World War Navy was rather small than the Second World War Navy. But even in World War One, because the Italian nation was relatively new, it was a relatively modern navy for its time. It wasn't particularly large or even really well equipped or even particularly well trained, but it was relatively modern. For its day in 1912, and the Italians were able to send a sizable contingent of soldiers over to North Africa. They were able to capture these ports at Tobruk, at Benghazi, at Derna in the east, and of course they take Tripoli in the western part of Libya. And there are obviously sort of skirmishes between Turkish and Italian troops, but because the Turkish troops are quite literally cut off because there's this British sort of mandate of Egypt, this British protectorate, the Turks can only supply overseas. Of course, North Africa, or the location of modern day Libya, it's in far closer proximity to Italy than it is to the Aegean, to the Ottoman sort of sea power where it's located. And so the war is relatively, conclusive in favor of Italy. And like I said, despite its troubles, it actually has a sort of a relatively, modern navy, has a relatively modern army as well, although not particularly well led, probably no better in quality terms, or slightly better than the Turkish army, but or the Ottoman army, but not a whole lot better. But the Italians also succeed as well in seizing Rhodes and the Dodecanese Islands. I believe that's a part of the treaty stipulations at the end of this war, because in 1912, both things happen at once. There's this Italian war with the Ottoman Empire, and there's the First Balkan War. So basically, the Ottomans are in a place where they're trying to cut their losses as best as possible, because both entities realize, whether it's the Balkan League, the Balkan Alliance, or the Italians, they realize that the Ottoman state, rightly, is in a place of profound weakness, both diplomatically and militarily.
Well, what is, again, to add to your points, what is equally fascinating about the Italo-Turkish War, you mentioned the acquisitions, you mentioned the retraction of the Ottoman Empire that will ensue over the next few years, and really accelerated retraction after this halfway house that the Ottoman Empire has been left in as a result of the Treaty of Berlin in 1878, is that this also definitively drives the Ottomans into the German camp. And de facto, it is the end of the Triple Alliance between Austria, Germany, and Italy, because this has been motivated by Britain, by France, by the Entente powers. Essentially, the Entente powers have confirmed their control in the Agadir crisis over Morocco, and therefore, by extension, we are seeing the encroachment of Entente power vis-a-vis the Ottoman Empire in the Dodecanese and Libya. So this is encouraged by the French and the British against the ally of Germany. So the Triple Alliance is effectively dead. And this, you can say, is one of the most obvious examples of the fact that Britain has completely recontextualized its understanding of its commitments to the Ottoman Empire. We have the Anglo-Persian Agreement in 1907. Britain will increasingly become dependent on the Russian Empire, and from 1914 there will be full-fledged allies. So it really is remarkable to consider that, given the course of the 19th century, how dramatically things have now changed, where the Russians are encroaching upon the Ottoman Empire from the north, the Italians as the proxies, the British and the French, the British who have already established possessions in Cyprus and in Egypt, are now assaulting the Ottoman Empire from the south. And so the Ottomans are becoming more dependent on the Germans. At the same time, all of these powers these fragmented nations within the Balkans have varying allegiances. The Romanians and the Bulgarians are closer to the Austrians, the Germans. The Greeks are in this awful situation where they're essentially nothing more than the hot potato. I hate to use that analogy, but I think it's very true, between the various powers. And Serbia is being driven into the Russian camp as a result of the May regicide. All of these factors have coincided effectively to doom the Ottoman Empire, because in 1911, 1912, the Germans aren't prepared to side militarily with the Ottomans against their own ally, their nominal ally in the Triple Alliance. Already in 1908, the Austrians had formally incorporated Bosnia and Herzegovina into the Austrian Empire, again weakening the links between the Ottomans and the Germans.
Which we have
So
covered several times on the channel.
yes, which we have covered several times. So everything essentially is coinciding. We have a concatenation of events which is going to doom the existence of the Ottoman Empire in Europe. And this leads to the First Balkan War, which, as you've mentioned, results in Romania, Serbia, Bulgaria, Montenegro, Greece ganging up on this Ottoman Empire, which had just been defeated by the weakest of the Western European colonial powers, Italy, possibly with the exception of Belgium and Portugal. And look at this sort of radical redrawing of the map you see here, where all of these territories have now effectively been lost, and great powers are again intervening in this territory to try and divvy up various provinces. And again, you can say here, 1912, before the Second Balkan War of 1913, it very much looks as if Bulgaria is going to be the central protagonist of the Balkans. Of course, Bulgaria is very close to the German camp, so the Germans have basically acquiesced to the fact that Bulgaria is going to be but the extension of German and Austrian power in the Balkans as the Ottomans are receding and becoming confined to Anatolia, as they are becoming far more Turkified in the process. By extension, the Austrians contrive a situation where there is an independent state of Albania, because the Austrians are terrified at having the Serbs gain access to the sea, while the Austrians are building up their naval power in the Adriatic. And you can say, following in the coattails of these powers, because is it fair to say that the prime military instigators of the conflict, Romania has gained some peripheral territories as well in the Dobruzhda, but do you think it's fair to say that it's very much the Bulgarians and the Serbians who are the principal military actors as opposed to the Greeks?
Well, I'd say that if I was to judge it as such, I'd say that probably Bulgaria is the primary protagonist. And there's that saying about at this point in time in history, Bulgaria is considered by many, particularly even from its German ally, that it's the Prussia of the Balkans. And considering the size of the population, the Bulgarians actually filled a relatively large and a relatively well-equipped army for its time during both Balkan conflicts, both in 1912 and 1913, and indeed do so again in World War One. But I would call, by order of sort of, to establish some order here, I'd say that Bulgaria is probably the primary protagonist, and then I would say that Serbia 2, Greece 3, with a relatively small difference between Serbia and Greece, because if you read like writings about this campaign, which I'm not very familiar with, I will admit, but there's a great deal of wrangling between the priorities of the Serbian command and the Greek command, because essentially the modern day boundary between what you might call former Yugoslavia, what is now the Republic of North Macedonia, and modern day Greece is determined by this war. That northern boundary of sort of Greece and what is the Serbian kingdom at this point is determined by the outcome of this war, and basically who captures which cities at which point off this reeling Turkish army that basically is being flanked from all sides in the Balkans. And I find it interesting that meanwhile, the Bulgarians are carrying the brunt of the fighting. They're actually pushing towards Constantinople. Can you go back to that previous map where it's got the Balkan League? Yeah, here. So if you look at this top map here, you see there's this diagonal line across eastern Thrace. Bulgaria actually conquers Adrianople. and is threatening Constantinople, and the Turkish forces managed to sort of stop them on the outskirts of Constantinople, but only just. The Bulgarians are sort of doing a lot of this fighting in what is sort of central and eastern Thrace. Meanwhile, the Serbians and the Greeks sort of pincering the the Western Ottoman forces in sort of where on that northern map you just sort of see Macedonia written just north of Salonika there. There's this sort of convergence of Greek and Serbian armies. The Greeks get held up because they're attempting, or they do succeed in actually um, vanquishing the Ottoman forces in Epirus, which was their big sticking point, which again determines the modern day boundary of Albania and Greece. That's determined by the Greek campaigns in the western part of the country. But then there's sort of this race to Salonika, the race to Castoria. There's a great sort of competition, and eventually, like I've sort of reiterated, this boundary between the two countries today is settled in this war. Meanwhile, the Bulgarians they want to, and they do succeed in achieving a breakout to the Aegean, which they lose after World War One, and then they do again after World War Two, because they briefly reoccupied this territory during the Second World War. But yeah, that's more or less the summary of the First Balkan War and the goals, particularly of Bulgaria, Serbia, and Greece, respectively.
Well, just to look into the aspirations of Bulgaria and to emphasize your point of Bulgaria representing the Prussia of the Balkans, because this really is remarkable to consider. From 1878 up until 1908, as I mentioned before, Bulgaria is in this awkward quasi-autonomous relationship with the Ottoman Empire, despite the fact that Bulgaria is essentially building up its armed forces, and it's gone from being a Russian client state to being effectively a Central Powers ally, which will be activated in 1915. Bulgaria is still nominally only a principality until 1908, following the Young Turk Revolution in Constantinople. Now, finally, Bulgaria is recognized as an independent state. But it's not just recognized as an independent state, it is recognized as a Tsardom under Tsar Ferdinand. This is consciously imitating not only the Asen Empire, which broke away during the Angaloy dynasty, I think it was in the 1180s, but they are looking to the original Bulgarian Empire, which during the 7th and the 8th centuries, I think really up until you can say the 10th century, to the conquests of Basil II, Basil the Bulgar Slayer, Bulgaria was the greatest state in the Balkans, with varying sort of influences and sort of power plays between the Byzantines, of course, but that's neither here
The
nor there.
successes of Krum,
Yes, the point is, Bulgaria was breathing down at Constantinople and looked at various times, especially, I mean, if you look at the relationship between Justinian II and the Bulgars, that Constantinople could have potentially fallen to the Bulgarians at any point. Bulgaria has an imperial legacy, which Ferdinand in 1908 is grasping at to become the Tsar of Bulgaria, because, of course, it's not enough to just be a prince. To be Tsar is to imply Caesarian ambitions of universal control. Compared to the diminutive king of Greece, what is the diminutive king of Greece compared to the Tsar of Bulgaria, wresting control of that imperial legacy and potentially Constantinople? And as you can see, and as you've explained, they get very close in 1912 to realizing this goal with the loss of Edirne Adrianople. So what is sort of fascinating here is to consider the population of Bulgaria. If I'm right, the Bulgarian state as it existed before 1912 probably only has a population of about 4 to 5 million people. In the First Balkan War, the Bulgarians field an army of nearly 500,000 men. I mean, just consider the level of militarization to be able to produce an army in such numbers, but not only an army.
and also of quality.
Yes, exactly. An army of quality, which is able to, having only achieved full independence in 1908, is 4 years later able to achieve decisive victories against the Ottoman Empire, which had ruled over this territory for 400 years. And again, I hate to push back against you slightly, but I really do think that the Greek campaign here is residual. It's riding off the coattails, because if you look at Serbia, Serbia contributes half as many men as Bulgaria, Bulgaria very much being the leading power in this.
Hmm.
Greece, half of that of Serbia. Now look at Montenegro.
Well, we're green then, because that's basically my
Yes.
order of contribution.
Yes, exactly. But no, I'm talking about not just by order of half. It's significant in terms of looking at the Greek
Yes.
population, which is
It's not
still
a minuscule
larger.
difference.
Yes, it's not a minuscule difference. It's a factor of 50% each time.
Correct.
But look at
Correct.
Montenegro. Montenegro is a tiny state, and Montenegro is half of the Greek contribution. So I would say per capita, the Montenegrin contribution to victory is actually greater than that of the Greek contribution, which is interesting to
Exactly.
consider. But the point we're sort of illustrating is that it very much seems that this idea of the Greco-Turkish 100 Years' War, which comes into play later in this scenario, is almost irrelevant here. The principal protagonist is Bulgaria. Bulgaria is the one which is going to carve out an empire in the Balkans. And all of this is shockingly reversed 1 year later when you see the Second Balkan War. So very briefly, do you want to explain what happens here?
Sorry, you just cut out on me. What was the question, I am?
Sorry, do you want to very briefly discuss the betrayal of Bulgaria and the dramatic about turn in history when the other powers gang up on Bulgaria?
Well, again, like I said, I don't actually have notes on this. So I do apologize, but essentially, the Bulgarians do achieve this preeminent position. You know, they obviously carry the load of the fighting in the First Balkan War. They make the by far the greatest territorial gains in the. Oh, hang on. Oh yes. Oh, this is the First World War. They obviously make the largest gains as a result of the First Balkan War, but within a calendar year, the Bulgarians find themselves basically being attacked from all directions. Previously, this alliance that had ganged up on the Ottoman Empire make friends with the Turks, albeit temporarily, and assail Bulgaria from each side. And actually, someone in the chat he just mentioned, I don't know, was it no Antonis A. Yeah, in the Second Balkan War, the Bulgarians fielded an even larger force. Rather than 500,000, it's 600,000. They militarize even further, and they're attacked by the Greeks from the south, the Serbians from the west, the Romanians from the north, and the Turks from the southeast. And then the Bulgarians are sort of brought to bargain and assume the territories which they then have at the onset of World War One. Sadly, I can't read too much into the causes of it. I know the only thing I do know is that Bulgaria held a preeminent position after the war and felt like they deserved even more as a result of it. But definitely its neighbors, how should I say, take advantage of the fact that Bulgaria, even though it is a very militarized state, is essentially surrounded by everyone. It's sandwiched in between all the other powers, and so its advantage is also a weakness in itself, and its erstwhile friends take advantage of that.
Well, just to build on some of the points you mentioned, the principal bone of contention is in Macedonia. Macedonia, of course, has a relatively, again, it's difficult to refer to Macedonia as having a Bulgarian population, but it's very much sort of Bulgarianized, if that makes sense, because there is a diaspora of Aromanians, Bulgarians, Serbs, and Macedonians who I will admit that I can't really contextualize what exactly the Macedonian ethnicity in Slavic
Indeed,
terms
and
is.
there's pockets of Albanian speakers, there's pocket of Greek speakers. It's a very disparate place of it's a
Yes,
very much a
exactly.
mixed area in that regard.
But Bulgaria very much considers Macedonia to be part of the would-be Bulgarian nation. And if I
Their
remember
patrimony of
correctly,
sorts, yeah.
in the original Treaty of San Stefano, you can almost say that San Stefano is the blueprint for later Bulgarian ambitions, having been denied that all the way back in 1877, 1878. And Macedonia and the Thrace, the port on the Mediterranean, all these territories are ceded to Bulgaria, only to be very quickly denied. So Macedonia, but it's not just the population of Macedonia. Macedonia gives Bulgaria a commanding position against the Serbs, against the Greeks, and you can also say it is very much in the interests of the Austrians and very much in the interest of the Germans to support Bulgaria in this. Alas, they do not. And as you mentioned, Greece has territorial aspirations on Bulgaria. Romania has territorial aspirations on Bulgaria. And of course, the Ottomans, reeling after this humiliation in 1912, are very anxious to get payback on the Bulgarians. So Bulgaria, having established itself as the protagonist of the Balkans, is dealt this humiliating defeat, despite all the efforts to militarize even further and conscript even more men to fight in the Bulgarian army. And this betrayal is very much the basis for what we see later in the history, very quickly after. I mean, to look at the First World War out of context, removed from the other great powers, you can very much see that the Great War in the Balkans is actually the continuation of these themes that we've established, with the Italians basically being given a blank check by the Entente powers to attack the Ottomans, in the same way that the Serbs were encouraged by the Russians to gain this vast segment of territory, in the way that the Allies are now looking at Greece as a potential ally rather than something to restrict, as we saw with the Crete Revolution. All of these developments have been made in the preceding years, and you can say that when the Great War breaks out in the Balkans, it is the culmination of this. The Austrians have been essentially dealing with a hostile Serb state since 1902. They increased their strategic control in Bosnia-Herzegovina in 1908. And of course, the original casus belli is directed against Serbia in 1914 with the intention essentially of regime change, divesting the Serbian political hierarchy of the influence of the Black Hand, who are radical Serbian irredentists, mostly directed against the Austrian Empire, because Serbia has now achieved this, as you can see, significant territory at the expense of Bulgaria. There's nowhere really for the Serbians to expand apart from possibly in Albania. Albania again, which is leaning towards the Austrians. So Montenegro, Serbia against the Austrian Empire. But again, where is Greece in this? Greece is neutral under its king Constantine. Romania is still technically an ally of the Austrian powers. So again, going back to my original point, which begins the discussion, all of these seemingly contradictory elements in history make conceiving of this in terms of a consistent narrative very difficult, which is why we almost have to get beyond the Great War in the Balkans, get beyond this idea of Bulgaria representing the Balkan protagonist, to get to Greece as part of the dominant narrative again. Because in terms of trying to come up with thematic continuities, of course, there is the quest for Constantinople, this idea which I brought up earlier about the race to Constantinople, because in the early years of the war, it isn't Bulgaria, which is the nation which is going to, or Greece, which is the nation which is going to bear down on Constantinople. As you know, Marcus, it is in fact Britain and the Anzac powers, of course. You have a sort of direct sort of historical connection indeed to the Italian connection with this. So, and of course, when we look at what this would entail, what would the loss of Constantinople in the First World War to the Entente powers represent? You can say it could either represent Russia taking over Constantinople again, which I believe very unlikely, even though that was promised to the Russians. Instead, I believe it far more likely that the British would have instead essentially established what they would in the early 1920s, which is this zone of the Straits, where effectively the area between Gallipoli, the Dardanelles Straits, and the Bosphorus Straits would have become a British protectorate, and Constantinople would have effectively become a quote-unquote free port, free city, which is in reality controlled by the British, with a caliph, which is an extension of Britain trying to control the Muslim world by extension. So this...
It would have been essentially would have been a Bosporan Danzig of sorts.
Well, Bosporan Danzig, but on a bigger scale. And again, in terms of coming up with thematic continuities within the whole sweep of orthodoxy, autocracy, and nationality, what does this remind you of? The Latin Empire, the Francocratia,
Mm.
establishing some sort of Western imposed state.
Except in this case, a Britannicratia.
Yes, Britannicratia. No, I think that's a fair enough to say. We've gone from Francocratia and we're now at Britannicratia in terms of trying to draw these disparate connections together. But I think in any situation, because of the inevitable conflict between Russia and Britain, despite the fact that in the Great War there are nominal allies, I mean, Britain is more than willing to betray Russia, in the same way that Britain betrayed Italy with the Treaty of London in 1915, promising them control over Dalmatia, control over Albania. All of these things are ultimately denied with American acquiescence. But I very much doubt that the British would have been interested in following through those promises anyway. In the same way that Britain, had Gallipoli succeeded, would have possibly gained a controlling interest, even had Russia survived the war and not had the revolution. So even though you can say that this would represent another thematic arc, which is the culmination of the Greek plan, the possession of Constantinople by the Russians, I believe in this scenario there is virtually no likelihood of that happening, despite that being an ostensible war goal of the expansionist Tsar Nicholas II. Now bring Bulgaria back into this. After the defeat of the Entente powers in Gallipoli and the unexpected victory of the Ottoman Empire, again with German support, Bulgaria is encouraged during this conflict to flip sides. And for Bulgaria, this ostensibly is a very wise decision. Greece still has no interest in joining the war, despite the fact that the British have basically blatantly violated Greek sovereignty by establishing a presence in Salonika, Thessaloniki.
What they call the largest Allied camp in southern Europe. That's what they called Thessaloniki during World War One.
But also just consider they are not at war. They are not at war with the Central Powers, and the British are just doing this by pure military fiat. Greece resolutely, under King Constantine, wants to remain neutral. The British already have a controlling influence, as we've seen in Cyprus and Egypt, which is part of the direction of the conflict against Gallipoli. But again, it serves their interest just to intervene liberally and violate the neutrality of Greece.
Also, don't forget the British presence also on Samothrake and Lesbos, because a lot of the evacuees are wounded from, we see here on this left diagram here, the Allied landings at Cape Helles and the broad there's that northern one there at Ari Bunu, but this campaign here on the Dardanelles, many Allied men are evacuated when they're severely wounded from this front and taken to Greek islands where there are Allied hospitals established on them. And again, it's done via this military fiat. The Greeks don't really consent to it. It just happens.
And that's something, again, really remarkable to consider. But again, doesn't this seem like an extension of the Britannicratia, what we're calling it? I mean, there was already a Francocratic state called the Kingdom of Thessaloniki.
This channel is trademarking Britannicratia as a term.
Well, no, I very much like it in the context of British influence in the early 20th century. I think also the Greeks would like that term in terms of this age-old animus towards the British, which I think if you look at these
and it plays the Byzantine themes as well.
Yes, instead of the overall hatred stemming from the Fourth Crusade, now we're looking at the denied potential of the Megali idea. But going back to Bulgaria, after the humiliation of 1913, it looks as if Bulgaria is again going to position itself as the central protagonist of the Balkans. Romania enters the war as a result of the Brusilov offensive on the Entente side. And as a result of this, Romania is occupied by the Austrians, the Germans, and the Bulgarians. They temporarily reclaim some territory. In the same way that the Austrians have no intention of annexing Serbian territory, because they already have enough problem with their Serb population in the territory of the Austrian Empire as is. So any territorial acquisitions that would be made at the expense of Serbia would have in fact gone to Bulgaria. Bulgaria would have gained controlling influence over southern Serbia and, of course, Macedonia. So had the Central Powers won the war, it is very likely that Bulgaria would have been able to establish a commanding presence over the Balkans. Indeed, the fact had, say, for example, Greece remained neutral in the conflict, Greece would have remained with its territory established as a result of the Second Balkan War. And also because the Ottomans are, of course, on the side of the Central Powers, the Bulgarians wouldn't have been able to achieve any territorial acquisitions at the expense of the Ottomans. Nevertheless, when we're looking at territory at the expense of the Serbs and at the expense of the Romanians, Bulgaria has more than enough in the way of potential territorial annexations to establish its primacy in the Balkans.
Just on that point, though, at least the Bulgarians wouldn't have had to have worried about being attacked from its rear. Whilst being on the same side as the Ottomans, at least it could depend on a quiet front, in Thrace on that matter. It could turn all of its attention against Serbia and, for instance, and Romania. It's
Yes,
not splitting its attention, which it's done in most of its wars since its re-establishment as a country.
Well, again, it's not just that. I mean, if Serbia was dismembered by Bulgaria and the rump of Serbia was basically an Austrian satellite state, in the same way, if Romania were reconstituted as an Austrian satellite state, then Bulgaria wouldn't have any issues on any of their fronts.
Correct.
Nevertheless,
Correct.
I mean, in the long term, we're talking about German-Austrian influence over Bulgaria, the extension of control to Basra and the, Berlin to Baghdad railway, but that's another question, really. And as Rupert August is saying, the realization finally of the aspirations of San Stefano in 1877 and 1878, which is important to consider. The only time,
at least in the West, as he says, and I agree with him, he read my mind exactly.
The only time that Bulgaria would be close to realizing these territorial acquisitions again would be during the Second World War, but that conversation is really neither here nor there.
Yes, and we should say short-lived as well for Bulgaria.
So Greece is compelled into the Allied camp. And again, this is where I really want to get your insight into this, because this is only achieved as a result of a pro-Entente coup backed by the British in Greece. Constantine is deposed despite his popularity in Greece. Alexander is made king of Greece, and Alexander is immediately sidelined politically, because before then, under King George and under King Constantine, you can say that Greece is similar to Germany in terms of political constitution, i.e. you have a dominant monarchical figurehead with parliamentary overtures, but not government by parliament. What 1917 briefly establishes is a government by parliament, but not just government by any parliament, a parliament which has been led by Venizelos. You see the figure here. He's
Venizelos, yeah.
Yes, he is a committed liberal, but of course he is also adamant to restore Greek territories. So,
and also an Anglophile too.
Anglophile. So the entry, the forced entry of Greece into the war in 1917 is built off the back again, like the London Treaty with Italy, of this expectation of seismic territorial acquisitions at the expense of Bulgaria and at the expense of the Ottoman Empire. So would you like to summarize briefly how we go from Greece entering the war and the Paris peace treaties?
From a military standpoint, or just broadly speaking?
Just broadly, I mean, we don't really need to get into the military standpoint, because just to summarize this, the Greek role in this, as we see throughout the entirety of this period, the Greek role in World War I is not decisive. What is important in the context of this conversation is the access which Greek territory gives to Allied powers, access which had already been wrestled from them through pure military fiat, but also it bears consideration in terms of the expectations of Greek territorial acquisitions. That's really how this is significant for this conversation, because as you can see with the Paris Peace Treaty, which has been dealt at Bulgaria, Bulgaria loses significant territories to Greece, and it loses even more territory to Serbia. These regions you can see in the west, of course, are ethnically Bulgarian, and they are ethnically Bulgarian even to this day. The reason these territories were awarded to Serbia vis-a-vis Bulgaria is because they essentially give Serbia a mountain frontier in which to deflect any potential Bulgarian attack. That is the sole reason why they were given to Bulgaria.
It's a strategic and defensive,
advantage given to
essentially.
Serbia
Advantage, yeah.
against a
Yeah.
weakened Bulgaria, which,
Mm.
like Germany, is essentially demilitarized as a result of this. It
Mm.
goes from being the Prussia of the Balkans to the basket case of the Balkans,
Yes.
effectively. And there is a whole
And
system of alliances contrived to prevent the resurgence of Bulgaria ever again, mainly checked by the Greeks, the Romanians, and the Serbs, who are now the Yugoslavs.
Indeed. And it's worth noting here as well, there's an important little thing that occurs with the Bulgarian Treaty of 1919, and you can sort of see here on this map. I was going to reflect on the previous map, but this map actually shows it even more clearly. Is that prior to the outcome of World War One being decided at Versailles, the Greek nation doesn't in the aftermath of the Balkan Wars and throughout World War One, the Greek nation does not share a border with the Ottoman Empire. Obviously, their territory is split by this sort of this Bulgarian access to the sea. What could be probably described as Central Thrace might be a good word to use, because the name of this territory changes over the centuries. It's it's Rhodope, and then it's Bolaron, and then it's Hamimontis. There's a whole bunch of territorial provincial names for this area. Anyway, the point is that the Bulgarians lose this access to the sea into the Aegean, and it becomes a part of Greece after World War One, after the aftermath of the Treaty of Versailles. And here we see now there's a proper border once again between the Ottoman state and the Greek state, and so this provides the Greeks with an ability to, should they wish to, then springboard to implementing this Megali idea that is being championed by Venizelos and the Greek liberals. They actually have the ability to do so, because again, had this territorial concession not occurred, then the Greeks would not have had access to a direct border with the Ottoman Empire with which to enforce this. But this is sort of precisely what happens. It sort of allows a bit of a pathway for such a vision to be implemented, although the Greeks in fact land troops in Smyrna using the Greek navy, because at this point the entirety of the Ottoman armed forces is reeling. They're just in total disarray. The Ottoman navy is essentially non-functional. The Ottoman army, sort of being rallied by Kemal Ataturk, is more or less trying to coalesce itself in central Anatolia. So, but what we do see is also because there's the history of this is quite complicated. By all means, feel free to chime in, AM, if I'm getting this a little bit wrong. But the Ottoman, the Treaty of and my French isn't good enough to pronounce it. I apologize, but the Ottomans do. The Ottoman government obviously signs. I think it's
can I?
treaty.
I know
Sure.
what point you're getting to, but
Yeah.
I would like to stop you there
No,
if
of
that's
course.
possible, because I need to set up some necessary context before we
As
move on to the
to
Ottoman
stick with
situation.
Bulgaria. Okay.
Yes,
So sorry.
but in terms of
is it worth
Bulgaria,
mentioning with Bulgaria?
yeah.
Oh, sorry. You go. No,
Well,
you go.
in terms of Bulgaria, I think you've set up quite nicely, especially regards to the acquisitions as a springboard for potential acquisitions vis-a-vis the Ottoman Empire, and of course the expectation of Venizelos and the Megali idea, albeit the Megali idea based on ethnicity, divorced from this orthodox conception that we brought up at the beginning with the Greek plan and the original idea of a Hellenic empire over the Balkans, inheriting and subverting this idea of the militarum. But just a thing I really need to clarify. I'm not getting at you at all, Marcus. Don't take offense at this, but also for the audience, is
of course.
the Paris Peace Treaties. Refer to these as the Paris Peace Treaties if you're going to use them in lieu of the proper treaties, because the Treaty of Versailles is pertinent towards Germany. The Treaty of Trianon is appropriate towards Hungary. The Treaty of Saint-Germain is appropriate towards Austria, the German Austria, after the dissolution of the Austrian Empire proper, Austro-Hungarian Empire proper, at the end of October in 1918. The treaty dealing with Bulgaria, as you can see on this, is Neuilly-sur-Seine, and the treaty, the first treaty dealing with the Ottomans is the Treaty of Sèvres. So it's much easier to say
Mm.
for the sake of accuracy, just Paris
Mm.
peace treaties,
Mm.
encompassing all of these specific treaties dealing with
Yes,
all of the Central
I
Powers.
can pronounce the words. I was just Nuis is just not. I don't have no good enough French to be able to pronounce that properly, so I don't even want to try.
But
Anyway,
no, this is a good point to
mm,
springboard into the Ottoman Empire,
mm,
because, of course, we need to talk about the final dissolution of the Ottoman Empire, because we have gone into so much Ottoman history on this series. And of course, we've talked, ad nauseum on this stream about the Ottomans in some way representing some Islamic Caesarism, continuity with this idea of the Roman Empire and the Second Rome of Constantinople. So looking at this, obviously, we talked about the deposition of the last strong sultan of the Ottoman Empire, Abdülhamid II, by the Young Turks. From 1908 up until 1913, there is this dramatic shift in what it means to be a Young Turk. The Young Turks and the general impetus behind Turkish liberals and the original Tanzimat, albeit that was under the aegis of Abdul Mejid and later Abdul Aziz, is this idea of Ottomanism, this idea of constitutional monarchy, essentially wanting to make the Ottomans closer to the British than anything else. However, with a transnational identity, which doesn't coincide with this idea of Turkey. After the humiliation of the Balkan Wars, all of a sudden, all of this territory is contracted, and you are left with a Turkish rump, even a Turkish rump within the context of the Balkans. The extension of the Turkish Empire is no longer into Europe, but it is now into the Middle East, with Syria and what would later become Iraq, and indeed the Hejaz and periods of Jordan, Palestine, Western Arabia, etc. So all of a sudden, in addition to having a supermajority of Muslims, we are now also talking about an empire which is far more Turkish than it was just a couple of years before. So in 1913, there was a second Young Turk revolution. This time, it is led by elements of the military who are not just Turkish, they are pan-Turkish. And the most prominent of the three pashas regime is Enver Pasha. So Ottoman expansionism is directed against Russia primarily, in terms of this realization not just of gains vis-a-vis the losses in the Russian-Turkish War of 1877, 1878, the region around Kars, but this idea of Armenian betrayal then becomes the impetus for some of the most egregious sort of population transfers and acts of cultural ethnic dispossession in the case of forcing the Armenian population to the Syrian desert and the ensuing deaths that fall from that. But what I'm trying to explain is that the Ottoman Empire has taken an aggressively nationalistic turn, and a nationalistic turn towards Turkification and pan-Turkism at that. Not just the
yeah,
expectation of territorial gains in the Caucasus, but also territorial gains in Central Asia. Indeed, Enver Pasha would end his career not in Turkey, but fighting essentially as a mercenary in the armies of the Emirate of the Emir of Bukhara, which of course is now located in modern-day Uzbekistan, in terms of the fervent aspirations of the Pan-Turkists. So as the
the
Ottoman Empire loses territory to the British in Mesopotamia, and as we see the Arab Revolt, and as we see the British and the French moving out of Egypt into Palestine, and then ultimately we go to Damascus, the Ottoman Empire has lost its empire in the Middle East. It essentially has been left with a core. And as you can see here, the stipulations of the Treaty of Sèvres were so severe that even the Anatolian core, which is now the Republic of Turkey, would have been dismembered even further than we see. I mean, really, you can say that what was intended for the Ottoman Empire was even more extreme than what was intended for Hungary, which ultimately would be the most severely punished power out of all of the Central Powers. I don't know why Hungary in particular. Well, I do know why.
yeah.
It was due to the
Also,
strategic
yeah.
considerations of the
Mm.
Petite Entente. But as you can see here,
And also
the
makes Versailles look like just a mere like tap on the back. I mean, this is an absolute butchery of a country. What we're seeing here
yes,
on this map.
Sèvres and Trianon are far more severe than what
Mm.
happened at Versailles by any degree, because as you can see, what is actually left as the core of the Ottoman Empire is just this region in the north around Ankara. The rest of it is, say, for example,
Yeah.
ceded to Greece, the region of Smyrna, the region. Actually, no, I want to get into the specific aspects around Smyrna because it's not that complicated. It's more complicated than this idea of a cession of territory. But as you can see, the region around Adrianople is ceded nominally to Greece. Armenia, a greater Armenia with access to the sea, is carved out of this treaty as well. But for the rest of what was now essentially the territory of the Republic of Turkey, the area around Antioch is given to the French. In between the British Mandate, Armenia, and France, there is going to be territorial continuity between these entities through the creation of a Kurdish state. In the remnants of the south in the Ottoman Empire, we see the division into French zones in the Taurus Mountain region and in the east, and into a significant Italian zone. You can say, Marcus, I think this is fair to say, that the creation of such a vast Italian zone of influence in southwestern Turkey is in some ways a compensation for the fact that Dalmatia is given to the kingdom of Serbia, the Croats, and the Slovenes, and they don't get that commanding influence of Albania. Do you think that's a fair thing to say?
Partially true, although I have to say, so far as maps go, because I've seen a lot of maps pertaining to Treaty of Sevres, because you can't sort of get to topics of Greece without coming across maps pertaining to the Megali idea and the Treaty of Sevres, etc. But this is one of the more how can I put it, sort of exaggerated maps. Like, I've seen instances of the Italian zone of influence not contain, for instance, here you see sort of Phrygia. That's the part of the Italian zone that is east of Smyrna and goes up to the pink where the zone of the Straits is. Like, I've seen maps that don't actually have that as a part of the Italian zone. I've also seen maps that don't contain Konya as a part of the Italian zone. So, I mean, this is probably taking it to its absolute maximal level. But indeed, I would say that even if you go the more minimalistic angle of assuming that the Italians attain a protection zone area that, forgive me for using the ancient place names, but of Caria, Lycia, Pisidia, and Pamphylia, which is sort of that southern coast and that sort of southwestern coast of Anatolia. Yes, I would say that so far, speaking from the opinion of the British and the French, it would have been a compensatory token to the Italians for having not fulfilled agreements and obligations in the Adriatic. I would agree with that.
But also, I think and I agree with you regarding the extremity of this map. The reason I chose it was in part due to the fact that it represents the limits of the ambitions against the Ottoman
maximal
Empire.
extent, yeah.
Because, of course, this whole map is a fiction. This is a treaty, nothing more. And again, this is probably one of the most extreme examples of Sevres representing a scrap of paper. There is nothing ultimately behind this. It collapses as a result of the Turkish Revolution and the leadership of Mustafa Kemal, who receives the epithet of Ataturk, father of the Turks, and on the ruin
ultimately
of
the
the
collapse
Ottoman
of the
Empire.
Ottoman government, because essentially the Ottoman government is sent into. Sorry, you go.
So no, that's the point I want to bring up, because
okay.
what other segment is haven't I mentioned yet? The zone of the Straits. This Danzig is actually on death on steroids, because I don't believe Danzig is not the only free city. There's also Fiume, which again is another sort of serious bone of contention vis-a-vis the Italians,
and another
separating.
yarn in its own right, shall we say?
Yes, separating Italy from the kingdom of the Serbs, the Croats, and the Slovenes. Again, I'm trying to be precise here because it doesn't become the kingdom of Yugoslavia until much later. And again, that's another just tangential point to consider, that Yugoslavia is not interested in essentially in establishing an empire as they were in the 14th century. Instead, they're directed towards the West. And from the 1920s and 1930s, Yugoslavia becomes a cornerstone of French policy in the Balkans as a result of the creation of this Yugoslavia, which is checked against Italy, checked against Austria, checked against Bulgaria, and checked against Hungary. But so therefore, adding Yugoslavia into this really is a different conversation. Indeed, we've talked about Yugoslavia and other streams ad nauseum. So bringing this back to the Ottomans, the zone of the Straits is the most extreme example of the international city. A contingent of the 14 points of Woodrow Wilson was this idea of freedom of the seas. However, in the case of the Bosphorus and the Dardanelles Straits, this is the culmination of British aspirations. And indeed, had the Russians been on the other side of the been on the victorious side of the war, Russian aspirations as well, in that there is an international power system which is controlling this quote unquote demilitarized zone with access to navies of all powers. In reality, these quote unquote free ports are an extension of British influence in this region. And this area has effectively ceded its sovereignty to international arbitration. But more importantly, Constantinople has essentially been ceded to this process of international arbitration, the loss of sovereignty. Now, this is a significant humiliation to the Ottomans, the fact that they're not sovereign over their own capital, but the idea that this is also a denial of the extreme of the Megali idea, the idea that Greek aspirations are directed towards Constantinople in particular. The British, as is to be expected, because what have the British done consistently since the beginning of this story? The British have denied the expectations of the Greeks in order always to prioritize their own interests. Greek expansionism has only ever sort of been permitted as an extension of British influence when we saw the dramatic about turn of British policy towards the Turks in the beginning of the 20th century. So,
and when we get to these extractions from that book that I said to you I was going to glean over, there's some very interesting quotations as to why the Levantine families, as they're called, become pro-Greek, and then why at the end of the story, when the Greek army disintegrates in Anatolia, why they flip back to being pro-Turkish. So there's an interesting, shall we say, these forces at play very much follow incentives.
and of course, there's another British influence reason as to why they want the Ottoman Empire to exist in this capital in which they are no longer sovereign, because it means that the British have control essentially over the Ottoman government, which is very useful for them, but they also have control over the Ottoman Sultan and, after 1922, the Ottoman Halif, which essentially means the British are placing under house arrest the nominal head of all Sunni Muslims. So another reason why the British don't want the Greeks occupying this territory. Why would the British want the Greeks to have their Constantinople and see the realization of these dreams going back to 1453? And as Rupert August is saying, there was also a widespread British Turkophilia. Benjamin Disraeli, of course, is an avid Turkophile, not just in the political sense, but also in terms of his Orientalism. But the idea that you can capture the Ottoman government here, and you can capture the religious head of the Sunni of essentially the broader Sunni empire. For the British, it makes complete sense to have the situation in which the Greeks are humiliated and the Ottomans are humiliated. And I just want to bring up Smyrna before I basically give this conversation over to Marcus, because this is really his forte. But regarding Smyrna, Smyrna is an awkward position in which the territory surrounding Smyrna is a concession to Greek occupation. It is not a cession of territory to Greece up until this point. The idea, essentially, is that the Greeks come in, they impose some sort of order over Smyrna, which really, at this time, is technically a part of the Ottoman Empire, as indeed the zones of the Straits are. But as we see, the Treaty of Sèvres was intended to make a complete nonsense of this notion. But the reason they weren't prepared to give the Greeks outright authority is that the secession of an occupation zone to the Greeks was really to prepare for a referendum in which the Greeks would have effectively, at gunpoint, gerrymandered the population into voting for union with Greece. That was the premise of Sèvres. And this indeed is a policy which had been consistent throughout the treaties of Paris. When we look, say, for example, of the regions of German Austria, which were given the vote, others weren't given the vote, such as the Sudeten populations in Germany. But when we look at areas in the Carniola, these territories were ceded to Yugoslav Slovenia, in the same way that portions of German Silesia voted to be part of Poland in the
Upper
same way that,
Silesia, especially around
yes, Upper
Katowice and
Silesia,
places like that. Yeah.
yes, which were again industrialized,
Hmm.
very useful for the creation of this new Polish state. And in the same way that they
Indeed.
tried, the Allied powers, the Entente powers, tried to get southern East Prussia also to join in with Poland, but this referendum was defeated. So the referenda here are targeted specifically to ensure the enlargement of the Entente allies. In this case, with Smyrna, it is Greece. So I'm going to give the floor over to you, Marcus, to really go into depth regarding the
Yes.
Greco-Turkish War of 1919 to 1922. So please go ahead.
I'll just buttress that last point that you made as well, because you said something earlier about Venizelos and how he basically had an ethnic motivation for the Magali idea. And it's true that even in Greek circles, he sort of referred to something as an ethnarch, which is indicative of itself. But also these territories which are make
Well,
up this.
just to comment on that point in particular, isn't it therefore appropriate that we begin this conversation when the consideration for Greece is that the ethnarch of the Greek population, and by extension the Orthodox population in the empire, is the ecumenical patriarch? And now we are seeing the title, the epithet of ethnarch, being bestowed onto a Greek liberal democrat who is thinking in consciously terms of populations, ethnic populations, and not religious populations. So again,
Indeed.
in terms of the idea of Greater Greece and the idea of a false dawn of Greater Greece, the idea of Greater Greece in 1919 is in no way similar to the idea of Greece as it existed before 1821. But anyway, that's my point. Please continue.
No, of course. And I think I can even back you up further on that by sort of saying that, one of the phrases that you've actually taught me is the idea of there being a Byzantine Commonwealth, that, it's not just ethnic Greeks, but, there's an incorporation for Bulgarians and to an extent, Avars, Isaurians, we've spoken about the Romanians, in the Balkans and Vlachs and all these sort of disparate peoples that sort of make up the idea of a Byzantine Empire. And how that notion then lives on through the ecumenical patriarch of Constantinople. But then the idea of the ethnarch, as you've rightly said, moves from this almost a spiritual conception of the ecumenical patriarch, this sort of dare I call it a transcendental kind of spiritual ideal, into a politicized material one. That transition occurs very quickly in a very short space of time, basically from the start of World War One to the end of World War One. Just an interesting standpoint. I mean, I'm not saying it's necessarily that. I'm just offering a reflection. Not, don't take it as gospel. But anyway, just what I was saying about Smyrna and the territory surrounding Smyrna, it was actually those were the limits that more or less Venizelos agreed to, because those were the provinces or the areas within the Ottoman Aegean coast that constituted a Greek majority. So the point that AM makes about they would have held referendums to basically sort of ensure or to justify the incorporation of that territory into Greece made sense from the standpoint that, yes, it's one of those things where the Greeks tended to populate the extremities of the coasts and the urban areas, and then the Turks dominated the hinterland, which is a similar dynamic to, the Italians in the Adriatic, where the Italians were dominant on the coast and in the cities, and then Slovenes and Croats tend to populate the hinterlands. It's that very similar dynamic here. Again, I've seen maps that are very different as well. I've seen where there's been a larger Armenian contingent, a lesser Armenian contingent, larger pockets of Greeks, lesser pockets of Greeks. Like these ethnographic maps tend to vary an awful lot, but this is a fine example of it, where you can actually see these Greeks. There's a pocket there on the.
I just need for clarity for the audience.
Sure.
This is a map before the First World War. Yes. Just to emphasize that there is a significant Armenian contingent, and indeed you can see an Armenian contingent which is just opposite Constantinople. Remember that the Armenians had their own millet within the system of the Ottoman Empire, and they were also placed very prominently in terms of the economic and indeed the cultural life of the Ottoman Empire, as the Greeks during the 18th century were the most principled, population. They were the principal population, effectively, more so than the ethnic Turks. Indeed, the whole idea of being a Turk within the Ottoman Empire during the 18th century and the first part of the 19th century was almost an insult from the Ottoman elite. It was basically to refer to these rugged, parochial populations, which, as you mentioned, dwelt within the hinterlands of the Anatolian Peninsula. But there is a significant Armenian population. This Armenian population is decimated as a result of the genocide in the following from the defeat of Enver Pasha at the Battle of Sarikamish. But there is a significant contingent in the west. There is a significant contingent in Armenian Kilikia in the south here, and of course,
on the Black Sea
Pontus.
coast.
And this becomes the justification, as you can see in the Treaty of Sèvres, for this larger Armenia, which would actually overlap with areas of traditional Greek Pontic settlement in Trebizond. But just to explain this map a little bit more.
Indeed. I was going to say, and sadly, I didn't even think to do this. I should have actually shared a map with you. But there was actually a minor revolt on the Black Sea. There was actually the attempt to establish a Pontic republic, for the Greek minorities that populated these Black Sea settlements, cities such as Trebizond, such as Karasunta, Samsun, Sinope, etc. It was unsuccessful, obviously, and these Greeks obviously supported the Russians when they came through, and then obviously joined forces with the Armenians when they attempted to establish sovereignty for themselves. Just a quick point about the Armenians in Anatolia as well. Just two very quick points. One, if you look back on the streams we did with our friend Gudir last year, you'll see that Armenian presence in eastern Anatolia goes back a long time. In fact, it could be argued that the peoples of Urartu outdate the Hellenes in this part of the world. So the Armenian presence
that's not just debatable. That's factually correct. I mean, if we're going back
correct,
to Hayek,
yes.
The population of Armenia goes back probably 1,000 years before unless there are some
before
Azeri nationalists. Unless there are some Azeri nationalists in the chat.
Indeed. So there's that point, and then the second part to that answer, or that tangent, I'm very briefly going to go down, is that once West Rome is sort of dissolved and collapses, and you have the East Roman Empire and this sort of empire that continues after Justinian and after Heraclius, etc., is that Armenians play a very prominent role, particularly under the resurgence under the Macedonian dynasties. From Basil I onwards up until basically Basil II, there are military leaders. Essentially the Phocas family could be argued to have Armenian descent. The Zamiskis, John Zamiskis certainly has Armenian descent, as is true also for the Korkuas family. The Armenians have an enduring and a very preeminent presence in the East Roman Empire prior to the arrival of the Turks following the Battle of Manzikert. So these pockets of Armenians could even extend back to that time period. It's just a point to account for regarding Anatolia.
I think it's because we're talking about a fundamental radical shift in the ethnic composition of Anatolia. So therefore, it's only consistent with the themes that we brought up that when we have the Greek Revolution in 1821, it is seen as an ethnic betrayal of the Greeks, and so there are pogroms and targeted executions, some which are actively facilitated by the Porte against the Greek populations, and an overall dethronement of the Greek Phanariotes. In the context of Armenia, the same thing applies following the Battle of Sarikamish. There is this idea among the Turkish nationalists who have become increasingly nationalistic, adopting this Turkish identity, as the Ottoman Empire has become nothing more than window dressing. The Sultan at this point has no power whatsoever. So in the context of Sarikamish, you can say that the Armenians are treated in the same way following the Greek Revolution of 1821. All of these things are connected. However, the Armenians and the Greeks have together played a significant part of Anatolian life. And from 1914 onwards, we see the trend, which is just going to exacerbate throughout the remaining decade, not just targeted at the Armenians, but now has been targeted towards Greeks. Nevertheless, unlike the Armenians, in which there was never any possibility without international enforcement, that this Armenian state was going to achieve those boundaries. It would have required a British and a French intervention through Kurdistan. And indeed, as we saw, after the victory of the Reds in the Russian Civil War, Armenia would be reincorporated into the Russian Empire, by extension of the Soviet Union, as a Soviet Socialist Republic. So Armenia is a different conversation entirely, because its fate is far more sort of tragic than that of Greece, even in the context of this conversation. But Greece is actually in a position where it could possibly enforce these stipulations of Severus. So I think this is a good time to come back to why it failed, this attempt to gain territory against the Ottomans.
Absolutely, and it's worth mentioning too, just on very briefly on the standpoint of the forces at play, is that Greece enters the war relatively late, in 1917, if memory serves me correct, because they partake in I've got his name here. Yeah, so the Allied commander of the Allied force in Thessaloniki ends up falling to one man by the name of Louis Félix Marie Francois Franchet d'Esprit, who's the French commander of this army corps. He originally is on the Western Front, but he eventually takes command of that force in Thessaloniki, and he basically masterminds the total collapse of the Bulgarian army. He successfully liberates Serbia, and then he pushes into Hungary proper. There's an entire sort of, if you want, I won't go into it, but there's an entire Wikipedia article about the liberation of the Balkans under this French general, because it's very much a joint force of there's Serbian divisions, there's Greek divisions, there's French divisions, there's British divisions. It's very much a joint effort.
Well, no, I think this is actually an interesting tangent, because in my view, he was the most sort of, in terms of a military effort directed against the Austro-Hungarian Empire, he has the greatest responsibility for the end of Austria-Hungary, far more so than the Italians and the so-called Battle of Vittorio Veneto, which of course happens after the dissolution of Austria-Hungary. But no. Again, continue with your point. That's just
no, that's fine. And the interesting thing with this French gentleman here is that he actually mimics, or rather he mocks to some degree, the Turks who live in Istanbul, or Constantinople as it was then still known. He attempts to mimic when Mehmed II marched through the St. Romanus Gate and entered Constantinople as a conqueror of the Byzantine Empire, the man who extinguishes it. He rides in on a white horse. You see it in that famous painting where he makes his way through the gate. Franchet d'Esprit does the exact same thing. He actually he marches himself through, leading his contingent of French soldiers into Constantinople, riding a white horse, and sort of quite mockingly makes the point that he's there to reclaim it, basically for Christendom. But that's a small digression. Anyway, there's this the one thing to stipulate about this before we sort of get into this subject, into the meat and potatoes of it, so to speak, is that Smyrna, again, like Constantinople, we have to keep in mind both of these cities have what would you call it? They have a plurality of Christian populations. If you join the Armenians and the Greeks together, they actually outnumbered the Turks. And it's even more so in Smyrna than in Constantinople itself. I believe in Constantinople, they were about a 60% plurality of the urban population, whereas in Smyrna, it's in the order of like 70 to 75%. Then the populations amongst the hinterland are rather more dispersed, and, or rather it's less clear is the point I'm trying to make. But Smyrna is this very productive, very prosperous city. And what's interesting is that it's one of the few instances where you come across a phraseology that's actually used in a manner that we're not used to. And one of the terms that is used here is Levantine. And obviously we think of Levantine as being, Lebanon, the Palestinian coastline, that part of the world. But the phrase Levantine in respect to Smyrna is in reference to the Levantine families. Now, these are families who are either of British background, French background, Italian background, and in some cases too, Germans and Dutch. And these are people who, not exclusively, of course, because there were several people of Armenian and Greek and even Turkish, ethnic background who controlled aspects of industry and agriculture in this area. But these Levantine European families did have a large influence upon the culture and the commerce of, well, particularly Smyrna, but other places around it, such as, Aydin, which is the Greeks called Tralles. They did so also in what was also true even in Constantinople as well, amongst other cities. But Smyrna was really the focal point of this. And I'm just going to go and just mute for a second, AM, if you want to come in with anything. But I've got some quotes that sort of summarize what this part of the world is like, even in the immediate aftermath of World War One. So is there anything you want to chime in with before I quote the book?
No, I'm just interested to hear these quotations, so please continue. Hello?
Sorry, I'm here. No, I'm here. Sorry, I was just I'm just trying to get to my first bookmark. Here we go. I found it here. So the author of this book, which is it's called Paradise Lost, the destruction of Islam's city of tolerance, which is written by a British author, Giles Milton, who's a historian. And he actually he starts the book by having interviewed the survivor of the catastrophe, a man by the name of Petros Brussalis. And at the beginning of the interview, he actually he states this. So in conversation, this is how it starts. Here we go. Yes. Regarding Petros, Milton says this: his enunciation is that of his Edwardian governess. His sentiments are those of a man who has never quite recovered from the loss of his childhood. Petros said to me, "Forget Constantinople, forget Alexandria and Beirut," he says. "Smyrna, before the catastrophe, was the most cosmopolitan place on earth. The city into which Petros was born was one of which fig-laden camels nudged their way past the latest Newton Bennett motor car, in which the strange new vogue of the cinema was embraced as early as 1908. There were 17 companies dealing exclusively in imported Parisian luxuries. And if Petros's father cared to read the daily newspaper, he had quite the choice: 11 in Greek, 7 in Turkish, 5 in Armenian, 4 in French, and 5 in Hebrew, and not to mention the ones shipped from every capital city in Europe, not limited to but including German, Dutch, Italian, etc. The Brussalis family were well-to-do merchants whose offices stood in the heart of Smyrna. In the late afternoon, when the infamous imbat, or west wind, blew off the Aegean Sea, Petros's father and mother would dress up in their finery and join the evening passeggiata, that's an Italian word, by the way, meaning an evening stroll, along the Aegean waterfront. The imposing banks and clubhouses that lined the quayside were tangible symbols of Smyrna's prosperity. The Sporting Club, the Grand Hotel Kramer, the French Théâtre des Smyrnes, sorry if my pronunciation is terrible, were built on such a grand scale that their whitewashed walls, glimmering into the sunshine, were visible for miles out at sea. Amidst the grandeur, there was intense human activity. Hawkers and street traders peddled their wares along the mile-long quayside. Water sellers jangled their brass bowls. Hujjahs, Muslim holy men, mumbled prayers in the hope of earning a copper or two. Legal clerks, often Italian, would proffer language lessons at knockdown prices for foreigners. You saw all sorts, recalled the French journalist Gaston Deschamps: Swiss hoteliers, German traders, Austrian tailors, English mill owners, Dutch fig merchants, Italian brokers, Hungarian bureaucrats, Armenian agents and Greek bankers. The waterfront was lined with lively bars, brasseries, and shaded cafe gardens, each which tempted the palate with a series of enticing scents and tastes. The odor of roasted cinnamon would herald an Armenian patisserie. Apple smoke spilled forth from hookahs and the Turkish cafes. Coffee and olives, crushed mint and armagnac. Each smell was distinctive and revealed the presence of more than 3 dozen culinary traditions in the one place. Caucasian pastries, boeuf à la mode, Greek game pies, Yorkshire pudding could be found could all be found in the quayside restaurants of Smyrna. So that introductory excerpt should demonstrate to you the kind of city that Smyrna was. What say you, AM? Are you sort of surprised that Smyrna was this kind of a place in 1919, 1920?
No, not really. Partly because if you look at the map here, Smyrna is effectively opposite Athens in terms of its principal role in the Aegean. I do believe, I can't quite remember which ancient sort of Greek colonia. Uh, was it Ephesus, if I remember correctly, around that sort of territory?
Yeah, well, there was Ephesus and Miletus
Yes.
that were sort of close
Yes,
by. Yeah.
Ephesus and Miletus. And indeed, this is an interesting, if I remember correctly, Corinth, Miletus, Byzantium, in terms of a weird sort of tangent of colonia resulting in the creation of all of this that we're talking about. But it occupies a major sort of strategic location. It was opposite I believe Lesbos, but also near Chios. These were some of the richest areas of the Ottoman Empire before the Turkish perpetrated atrocities at the beginning of the 19th century. Indeed, if we look at the history of the capitulations, the Ottoman Empire is fascinating in the sense that it never adopted a system of mercantilism like the Spanish or the French empires in the 17th and the 18th centuries, because the Ottomans, and this was a system they inherited from the Byzantines, had essentially opened the doors to Western traders. In the case of the Byzantine Empire, this were essentially the fraught relationship between the Latins and the Greeks, which would have tragic consequences during the reign of Andronikos, and later on, of course, during the Fourth Crusade. So this interplay between the West and the East and the Ottoman Empire, which maintains this system of capitulations, and then the system of capitulations makes way for the system of extraterritoriality, which is a consistent trend throughout all of the weaker states, which had basically abandoned their sovereignty in the face of the collective might of the European great powers. China and cities such as Shanghai, Canton, Tianjin is another great example of this in terms of the metropolitan, cosmopolitan aspect to many of these cities. So I
I'd
really
say
think it.
pre-shogunate Nagasaki as well. There's an example of it
Well,
to an
I
extent.
mean, not really, but I get your point. But
Mm,
in the case of this, I think it's fair to say, as you say, Constantinople,
mm,
Smyrna, both of these cities represent two
mm,
sides of the same coin, effectively. So it doesn't
mm,
really surprise me, especially
mm,
when we talk about the level of German and then by extension Austrian economic penetration into
mm.
the state. So how do we come
Absolutely.
from here up until the situation between 1919 and 1922?
Okay, just very briefly, I just want to finish off because it's like only half the paragraph left. I'd just like to finish it because it gets into the influence of the Greeks. So, because it's worth actually stipulating that because this is at the bedrock of why Smyrna is central to the Greek claim in this part of the world. So, if I may, I'll be quick. Um, it was not just Petros's nose that enjoyed the evening promenade. The arias of frivolous Italian operettas drifted out from the open air bandstands, while the honky tonk of ragtime conveyed a message of fun from the more outre establishments. Consul George Horton, a contemporary of Petros's parents, recalled that each cafe had a favorite, a favorite political play or orchestra of guitars, mandolins, and zithers, and the entertainers grew increasingly animated as more and more wine was consumed and more people gathered round. Horton had lived in many places in the world, but nowhere caught his imagination like Smyrna. It had the climate of Southern California, the architecture of the Côte d'Azur, and the allure of nowhere else on earth. In no city in the world did East and West mingle physically and in so spectacular a fashion, he wrote. So this is the bit about the Greeks in the Greek presence. The city was dominated by the Greeks. They numbered around 320,000 and had a virtual monopoly on the trade in sticky figs, sultanas, and apricots, for which Smyrna was so famous. They also owned many of the city's flagship businesses, including the two largest department stores, Xenopulo, and Os, Os, sorry, long Greek word, Oristibak, which sold imported goods from across the globe. It was in this first emporium more than 8 decades ago that the young Petros Broussardus got his first taste of luxury. He remembers. Oh, sorry, this is about Broussardus. Don't worry about it. But I just want to make the point about the population. It continues here. Sorry, the Greeks had left their mark on every walk of life. Smyrna boasted scores of Orthodox churches and almost as many schools. The young Aristotle Onassis was one of the many local Greeks who attended the famous Arona school. Many of the city's best hotels, brasseries, and cafes were also run by Greeks. Establishments like the Acropoli, Luxembourg, and the North Pole. Yet Greek ownership did not lead to an exclusively Greek clientele. The Frenchman, Louis de Launay, passed one cafe and recalled seeing green turbans, red fezzes, embroidered Armenian hats, pink on a black backing, and the gleaming glass of the hookah pipes. The center of Greek business was on the waterfront, where the wealthiest merchants had their trading houses. One of these was Petros's godfather, the fig exporter who sold his fruit to merchants far and wide. You'd hear every language under the sun on the quayside, recalls Petros, and see the ships from everywhere in the world. There were so many of them that they'd have to moor with their sterns in the quay and wait for hours on end to either load or unload their goods. So this also demonstrates too that Smyrna was a massive center of trade and commerce. And yeah, I mean, I could opine more about the Levantines, but I think we've got a good idea of what
No,
Smyrna's like.
I think in terms of
Yeah.
flavor for this conversation, that
Yeah.
until we get to the Great Fire, I think
Of
that's
course.
enough.
No, of course.
Just on this point, sorry, I need to do a mea culpa here. If I mentioned that Miletus was the preceding colony, of course, no, I remember correctly now. It was Megara. Just to point that out, in case
Right. Yes.
someone else in the chat mentions my mistakes. It is quite a crucial mistake, and I do apologize. But they're all go back to Corinth. But anyway, no. Obviously, and someone I just mentioned is an interesting connotation, again, emphasizing the French outre, which literally means sort of over or beyond. And I think that's a brilliant way to describe the situation in Smyrna, especially not just outre in the sense that outre-mer, beyond the sea, in terms of the contrast with essentially Greece and Smyrna, literally over the sea, but also in the case that it is outre in contrast to the rest of the Ottoman Empire and Anatolia and Turkish Anatolia in that respect. So in all of these respects, it is outre. But I've already mentioned, set up the idea of the Smyrna concession, the idea that it was awarded to Greece as a zone of occupation, not a territory which is legally part of Greece, and thereby Greece could exert sovereignty. The Greeks had to basically claim this region for themselves off the back of the collapse of the Ottoman army and the Ottoman Empire in general. And this was to be the prelude for the Greeks essentially gerrymandering the population into voting for union, you can say Ionosis, with the rest of Greece. And of course, this would have given them not only control of one of the most important cities in the Eastern Mediterranean, but you can say it would have actually significantly changed the balance of power in the region. Greece would have gone from essentially a lackey, a non-entity in terms of the grand sort of scale of a European power politics, into a regional power, which the Republic of Turkey would later become. And also it would have put significant pressure on the zone of the Straits, effectively, because it would have been surrounded on all sides by Greece and Greek aspirations in particular for control over the Dardanelles and for control over Constantinople. In other words, we're setting up a scenario in which Constantinople, as well as Smyrna, could have ended up being Greek. But in terms of trying to execute this, the Greeks land in 1919, and something rather remarkable happens. A general assembly is proclaimed in Ankara, and effectively there is an insurgent movement within the Turkish camp which is opposed to the Ottoman Empire. Because as I mentioned earlier, the remarkable thing about the Treaty of Sèvres is that the Ottomans lose sovereignty over their own capital, and therefore sovereignty over their own government, which is now entrapped and basically placed under house arrest by the British. So the revolt, you can say, expectedly happens from Ankara, which is a central city in the context of Anatolia, relatively secure, and as part of this remnant of the Ottoman rump within Anatolia. And the hero of Gallipoli, Mustafa Kemal, assumes control over a new Turkish revolutionary army. And the question essentially becomes over Smyrna. If the Ottomans can be victorious over Smyrna and they can assert a independent Turkish power, a Turkish army over Anatolia, then it could potentially unravel the entire makeup of Severez. Because in the context of Europe, despite the fact that the Entente are victorious, they have so many different theatres in which to maintain control over. In the case of the Balkans, the French have to maintain power through a series of proxies carved out of the ruins of the Austro-Hungarian Empire. In this case, Romania, Greater Romania, Yugoslavia, Czechoslovakia. In the case of the East, they are having to prop up the Polish Republic against a resurgent Soviet Union, or rather an insurgent Soviet Union, and the prospect of Germany asserting control over the Balkans. And of course, the French also having to maintain a zone of occupation in the Rhineland, which again will be assisted by Belgian soldiers in 1923. So, and of course, the French have now established a mandate in Syria and in Lebanon, as the British are establishing a mandate in Mesopotamia, which will now become Iraq, Palestine, the Transjordan, etc. In other words, we are seeing a seismic increase in the level of the commitments of these powers at a time where they're all virtually bankrupt, it should be noted. So these are the conditions under which Severez was imposed. And of course, the expectation here is that the Turks are simply going to accept it. There is going to be no fight back, which is why Ataturk is so remarkable in this sense, because he basically achieved what Hitler achieved in the 1930s, albeit the Turkish reaction was immediate, as you can say, and directed against their own government. So it focuses
and
on
under great duress too. You got to think in the context of the fact that you have British occupation zones, French occupation zones. I mean, the Italian occupation zone was neither here nor there, but you have the landing of a Greek army in Anatolia that advances into the center. You have the Armenians in the east. I mean, this is a nation under siege. Actually, it's hardly a nation. It's sort of like an entity more than a nation at this point. Would
well,
you
it's
agree?
an embryo. It's an embryo of a nation, because again, the Ottomans. It is very convenient for the British actually not to play into this idea of the Ottomans representing an ethno-state. There had been a decisive turn from 1913 into conceiving the Ottoman Empire as a Turkish ethno-state. But people like Enver Pasha are now, fighting on behalf of the Emir of Bukhara in Central Asia. There doesn't seem to be any, there's no potentate.
Yeah,
There's no sword behind is it Mehmed VI in up until 1922, followed by for goodness sake, I can't remember the last caliph's name, but it'll come to me eventually. But the point is, there is essentially no expectation that the Turks will be able to achieve this. However, from the Greeks, I really want to get your commentary on this, because Churchill famously said the whole scope of world history changed as a result of a monkey bite, which I sort of
right.
Well, so I want to get your commentary on this, because King Alexander of Greece had been foisted on the throne as a result of a British-backed coup, which obviously brought Venizelos to power in 1917, which precipitated Greece entering the war on the side of the Entente powers, which has created this scenario here. In 1920, 1 year after Greek troops had landed in Smyrna to carve out this protectorate in the west, Alexander of Greece dies as per an exotic monkey bite. Following very soon after this, King Constantine makes a return, and of course King Constantine was famously opposed to any military intervention against the Ottomans or against the Bulgarians. And there was also a coalition of anti-Venizelist parties, or basically anti-liberal parties in Greece, supported by the king, who, despite the fact that I believe Venizelos wins the plurality of the vote in the elections in 1920, due to the way that the parliamentary constituencies are laid out, he is voted out during this election, and an anti-liberal coalition supporting King Constantine wins power. How significant was this in the overall scheme of the Greek defeat?
Indeed. Well, maybe if I just outline very briefly. what actually happens is in May 1919, there's an initial landing of the Greek army at Smyrna. I believe it's the 1st Infantry Division, which constitutes of about, I think, 12,000 men, and there was amongst them about 2,000 to 3,000 Armenian volunteers. And then what we have is an initial summer offensive, which occurs in 1920, in the summer of 1920. And this is where basically the Greeks do, and with assistance with the British, mind you, because there's a British contingent that's at the top of the Kocaeli Peninsula, which is across the sea from Istanbul or Constantinople, and they basically managed to successfully occupy this entire, what would you call, like the northwest quadrant of the Anatolian Peninsula, everywhere from actually. Yeah, okay, this map will do. Everywhere from say where Smyrna is, and if you go inland towards where that river, that's the Meander River, all the way up to Bursa, and then the Kocaeli Peninsula, which is south of Istanbul. That sort of rectangle, that square, is successfully occupied by the Allied
Just to
powers.
sort of bring back a sort of historical example. So would you say that this is the region roughly corresponding to the Empire of Nicaea?
Empire of Nicaea, yes,
Yeah.
very close to. Yeah, not exactly the same, but very close to, indeed. And it is at this time where this election takes place, and there is the I actually can't remember the name of the politician who led the right-wing party, but anyway, there's this election which occurs, and because of the acrimony between the left and right in Greece, or in this case, the liberals and conservatives, probably a better way of framing it, there's a somewhat of a purging of pro-Venizelos officers as well. And this is at the point where...
Sorry, just to give exact dates. So the extent of the offensive, as you mentioned, the Greeks advanced up until the late summer of 1920.
Yes.
Alexander dies in October of 1920.
Correct.
The election is almost immediately after, and we see the return of King Constantine, and the prime minister is Demetrios Rallis, just to fill in that bit of information.
Thank you, yes. Indeed, yes. And so there's an operational pause by the Greeks in September 1920. So in the context of the political upheaval, and also the fact that this offensive has dilapidated their strength somewhat, because we have to take into account the Greeks have around 100,000 men partaking in between the occupation and the offensive. The Greeks have an awful lot of troops that they have to supply over what is pretty difficult terrain, especially in the context of being the attacking force, being the hostile force. And so they pause in September 1920. Then there's the infamous, there's the election, the monkey bite, etc. In the context of this political sort of tumult at home, there's a sort of something of a purge of the pro-Venizelos officers in the army, and they're replaced by sort of loyal, royalists, pro-royalists, and this is where there's a decisive decision is taken. So, and I will go back to the book very, very briefly in a second, but essentially the Greeks are at this point where they could have fortified their gains. They could have dug in along defensible borders and basically waited for an arbitration by the West and protected the holdings of the Zone of the Straits and the sort of the Smyrna, should we call it the concession for now, and force a diplomatic outcome. Or they could have pushed to Ankara and or defeated the nascent Turkish, young Turk army from the battlefield, destroyed Kemal Ataturk's forces, and impose the most severe terms of the treaty, or fail. And so this leads to the very decisive battle of the, what the Greeks called the Battle of the Sangarios, and the Turks called the Battle of the Sakarya, which is the Sakarya River basically runs in front of Ankara if you're advancing from the west, as the Greeks were. And the overall strength of the Greek forces is about 120,000 all up, although that's not in the offensive, that's just the total Greek forces in the area, in the occupation zone. And the Ottomans, the Turkish force, the Ankara government, the Turkish forces have collectively about a strength of 90 to 95,000, although again, like the Greeks, they're not all at the front line. Now, the because these battles occur over the course of a month. This offensive action is initiated in mid-August, and peters out about mid-September. And the Greeks managed to take all of the high positions in a grueling fight. And if you read the book, the one that I'm reading from here, at the very top of the summit, where there's this sort of line of mountains or hilltops that sort of overlook the river, the Turks hold out to the absolute bitter end, but eventually the Greeks manage to take the high ground. But again, it's a bit of a stratagem from Ataturk, is that whilst he's coalescing new forces and he's strengthening his position, he's bringing up fresh troops, the Greeks are overextended. The Greeks are at the very limit of their supply. In some ways, it's kind of like I hate to say this, I had to do an analogy, but it's almost a bit of an analogy of the fate of what happened to the Germans in Russia, that you're sort of way so far beyond your lines of supply that you get tired at your point of ultimate victory.
I've got a better comparison. Talking about what's happening at the same time is, of course, Trotsky's invasion of Poland during the Polish-Soviet War and the Miracle of Warsaw, where it looks as if the Soviets are about to accelerate the international revolution, assist the Spartacists and the Hungarian state under Bela Kun, and then all of a sudden, contrary to everyone's expectations, not only did the Polish win, but the Polish were able to drive the Soviets back decisively.
Indeed. That's quite a good point, and I would agree with that comparison, because it's also contemporaneous. And so this is where things do start and unravel, because it's just as the Greeks do take the high ground overlooking the river, is when Ataturk sort of orders this counteroffensive, and then this Greek advance is decisively halted, and immediately the Greek divisions on the front are sort of sent reeling, and it becomes a bit of a house of dominoes. Now, if I go back to, because I've got several tabs, I do apologize, or rather, sticky notes. Here, I've got references to the battle, I'm pretty sure, here somewhere. But it ends up being quite the sort of calamity. It's such a heavily fought over part of the campaign, and even for the Greeks, it's almost this tragedy that they're sort of on the cusp. They can actually see Ankara. It's a bit like the Germans. They can see Moscow at the end of Operation Typhoon, and then there's this massive counteroffensive that sort of starts afterwards, that sort of unravels all of their great plans, as it were. But sorry, just bear with me for a second, because I know I've got these tabs here. I've just got to try and find where these are. The sticky notes are. Is there anything you want to interject with in the meantime, AM, whilst I try and find my notes? Or sorry, I've just got so many sticky notes. I'm trying to find which one it is.
No, in particular, the only thing I could offer were just general pointers. So yeah.
Okay, yeah, here we go. I found it here. I'll read from the start of the chapter, or not the start, the midpoint of the chapter. A reverse. Oh no, hang on. I'll go back a bit further. No, hang on. I'll go here. A reverse was the very thing the Greeks were determined to avoid. Having purged the army of Venizelos-backed commanders, they prepared themselves for action. Just 5 days after their meeting with Lloyd George, Greek forces prepared to push even deeper into Anatolia and deliver what it hoped would be a knockout blow to Mustafa Kemal's troops. The Greek generals in charge of the operation might have been wise to consider more carefully the ultimate goal of their military adventure. They were faced with two alternatives, each of which had as many drawbacks as advantages. And this is what I was mentioning before. Their first option was to establish an impregnable frontier between themselves and the Turks, a mined and fortified barbed wire border which would safeguard the Megali idea from Kemal's ramshackle but increasingly effective army, which at this point we have to take into account the Italians are smarting from the loss of parts of their concession, so supplying weapons to the Turks, much to my dismay, and also they are receiving arms shipments from the Soviets as well. Because this is how basically Kemal Ataturk was able to rebuild something of a military which to strike back against what was at this point a relatively modern Greek army. Sorry, back to the book. Where am I? The second option was to penetrate far inland in order to hunt down and annihilate the nationalist forces, whilst having the advantage of taking the fight to the enemy This also brought the corresponding risk of their overextended supply lines being ambushed. The Greek general staff the Greek general staff's preferred option had long been the first, a secure frontier. But each time they seemed to have achieved it, they found themselves confronting newly emboldened Turkish forces that kept up relentless attacks on their forward positions. The problem was compounded by the topography of Anatolia. The Greek army had occupied much of the flat pasture land that stretched inland from Smyrna. They had liberated village after village before coming to a halt at the foot of the escarpment that swept dramatically upwards to the great Anatolian plateau. This lowland position afforded them a most unsatisfactory frontier. Their border guards were continually harassed by Turkish irregulars, and communications with Smyrna were threatened by bands of guerrillas in the rear lines. The only possibility of preventing such attacks was to neutralize the Turkish forces dug into the top of the escarpment and then create a new frontier on the plateau itself. But it did not take a military genius to realize that the only practicable line for such a frontier lay a further 150 miles to the east, on the edge of the desert-like land in the heart of Anatolia. A frontier so far from Smyrna was sure to bring many more problems. It vastly increases the area which the invader has to occupy, wrote Toynbee, and yes, Arnold Toynbee, who was an eyewitness to these events, by the way. It lengthens his communications, leaves mountains hospitable to guerrillas in his rear, brings him up on the inclement plateau, and yet does not present him with a physically strong frontier which he can hold without effort. The Greek general staff plumped for the worst of all the options. They decided to scale the escarpment, capture the Turkish positions, and then create a new frontier right there on the edge of the plateau. It was a high-risk enterprise. The two armies were almost evenly matched, with some 35,000 men apiece at the point of contact. But the Greeks were far better equipped with machine guns, motor transport, and air cover. As a result, the Greek generals remained optimistic about capturing the commanding heights above them. Arnold Toynbee, reporting on the offensive for the Manchester Guardian, wrote in a series of vivid eyewitness dispatches from the battlefield. He arrived at a Greek battle headquarters at the end of March 1921, just in time to join the troops as they prepared for battle. The Greek strategy was to scale the escarpment in two separate advances. A northern group was to drive up over the broken ridges towards the town of Eskişehir, and the southern group, meanwhile, was to assault the town of Afyon Karahisar. Toynbee joined the northern offensive, hitching a lift in a motor ambulance over the rough tracks that led up to the escarpment. As we climbed painfully up to the heights, he wrote, I began to realize just how narrow margin the Greeks had gambled for a military decision in Anatolia. The craggy landscape was littered with weapon dumps and artillery stockpiles that would supply the 7th Division when it led the Greek right flank into battle. I mean, I could go further, but I'll probably leave it there for that element of it. But this is an insight into the scale of the Greek problems, the scale of what the Greek decision was to try and take the fight to Ataturk's forces in the depths of Anatolia, and ultimately ended up being their undoing. So is there anything you fancy chiming in with, AM?
No, I'm interested really to understand that the Greeks, despite the, I would say, sort of the limits of the Greek presence in the First World War, and the limits of, say, for example, facilitated expansion, the British were prepared to sort of permit the Greeks. It's interesting to me that the Greeks seem technologically advanced vis-a-vis the Ottomans, considering the Ottomans possessed a great power army, which the Turkish Grand Assembly and the insurrectionary nationalist movement have now taken over. But also, just before this battle, which great power joins with the Grand Assembly? The Soviet Union. In fact, it's interesting to consider whether there would have been a Turkey without the Soviet Union. But the Soviets were the ones to first, again, just to reinforce the comparison I made earlier regarding the Polish-Soviet War, not only are they contemporaneous, they're inextricably linked in terms of the Soviet policy regarding Turkey. And ultimately, Ataturk would adopt many elements which were, you can say, friendly to Soviet policy, in addition to his aggressive secularism and his desire to limit the expansionist goals of the Entente powers, which, of course, during this time represented an existential threat to the Soviet Union at a time of the international interventions. So I find it interesting to hear that the Greeks still had that decisive advantage. Nevertheless, the Turks had a tactical advantage over the Greeks, which they were able to exploit. So just to quickly explain, because I just want to get up to what happens to Smyrna now, just to finish this conversation, and then to briefly talk about the population transfers.
There's a paragraph about the hinge point where the Greeks lose on the outskirts. Shall I just mention that as well? Because that's very brief.
Very, very quickly, yeah.
Okay, sure thing. Okay, because it's just that it's Toynbee's writing, and it's pretty. It's very vivid. As darkness fell, an eerie silence descended over the landscape, broken by the occasional low boom of heavy artillery. A column of smoke began to rise sluggishly from behind the hill to our left rear. As it grew dusk, this smoke caught the reflection of the unseen fire below and stretched out down. Hang on, I'm just going to skip that paragraph. On March 29, after an intense battle was fought largely in hand-to-hand combat with knives and bayonets, the Greek 7th Division began to sense that the Turkish resistance was in trouble. The men in the vanguard clawed up the slopes of the upper escarpment with renewed confidence, fighting for every inch of land. After many hours of combat, they had at long last caught a glimpse of the top. They were within sight of their goal. The battle for the ridge was murderous and fraught with danger. All along the northern rim of the crest, there was a tilted outcrop of limestone scrag, wrote Toynbee, turning the slope for a few yards into a precipice, and here, where the mullahs met the scrag, lay most of the Greek dead. After one final push, the Greeks found themselves in possession of the heights of Kovalitsa. They had fought without a break for almost 2 days and now controlled the highest areas of the escarpment. Toynbee hung back while the last few pockets of Turkish resistance were snuffed out. Then, when the all clear sign was flashed down the slopes, he made his way up through the slim forest of mangy scrub oak until he reached the highest area of the land. As the sun rose and the mist cleared, it became evident how magnificent the position was. The Turkish trenches facing north commanded the southern exits of the defile, through which I had come the day before. From the crown of the hill, a rift in the midst suddenly revealed a corridor of plain stretching away towards Eskişehir, without nothing between us and it except a low ridge. A mile or so off, which a few Turks were still visible through the periscope. The situation on the ground inspired the less romantic sentiments. A thick pall of smoke hung over the summit, and the uppermost edges were tinged golden yellow by the light reflecting off the fires burning in the valley below. The heights were lit with corpses of Greek soldiers who had been slaughtered by bullets and bayonets. Many of their Turkish opponents had been shredded by shell fire and shrapnel. The spring sunshine provided little warmth in the daytime. As soon as dusk fell, a frosty chill enveloped the heights. The wounded faced the agonizing stretcher ride down from the escarpment, jolted over the rocks, paths, and riverbeds. And sort of Toynbee then goes to question the military logic of it, and then, of course, the implications of the Turkish counterattack thereafter, which I'll lead to people if they want to buy the book to read. But Toynbee's insights on this campaign are magnificent. And you can tell that fight for the heights of Kovalitsa was savage. I mean, to think that men are fighting for days on end without sleep and resorting to knives and bayonets, it was bloody contact. But given the length of Greek supply, basically Kemal Ataturk had the Greeks where he wanted them. And then what actually happens thereafter is that the Greek army begins to fold. The 7th and the 1st divisions are pushed off the heights, and then eventually there's an entire collapse of the front. To cut the long story short, because I know you want to get to Smyrna, and then there's an almost entire collapse. Well, there's a complete collapse of the front, and the Greeks are unable to establish any defensive line, more or less in a several weeks long or months long retreat back to Smyrna and back to the few cities that they hold along the coast. So where should we go from here?
No, I'm just conscious that we're coming out to 3 hours. No, thank you for
Mm,
that narration. So, in terms of how this is pertinent, there is a standoff for the next year after this battle between the revolutionary Turkish forces and the Greeks, particularly around Smyrna. From the Greek point of view, obviously, they have rolled the dice and they have failed in terms of their decisive campaign to dislodge the Greeks and, as you said earlier, impose the most extreme iteration of Severus. And indeed, just to emphasize my point earlier, the idea that had this victory been essentially a Greek victory, it would have seriously strengthened the Greek hand in negotiating for a possible concession, ultimate concession of Constantinople to Greece. So the
mm.
fact that they lose this battle completely in terms of this offensive and they're restricted back to these cities, now that potential is gone and they are now completely dependent on international arbitration, and they seek arbitration from Britain. Now Britain, of course, has vested a large sort of not just resources, but the entire sort of basis of Severus is, you can say, contingent on this proxy conflict between Greece and the Turkish revolutionaries. And Iron Duke has brought up earlier that, of course, the reason the Greek army was so well prepared in this case was because they had received their equipment from Britain.
Mm.
However,
And also, they spend the least time fighting of anyone involved as well in the war itself.
however, the British are now in a situation where they can no longer impose a treaty on Mustafa Kemal. He has the advantage. He has the enemy surrounded, and there is no enthusiasm from the Entente powers, given the overextension that they're suffering after the war, to impose all these various treaties, to intervene militarily to assist the Greeks. The Greeks are hinging on international arbitration, or essentially the threat of war, gunboat diplomacy. Indeed, there is a significant allied naval contingent in this region. Nevertheless, Mustafa Kemal Ataturk has no interest in negotiating. And finally, Smyrna falls. So, very briefly, would you like to explain essentially what happens when Smyrna falls to the Turkish forces?
Well, it's less of a military story, I suppose, because sort of
Yes,
like
exactly. I'm more interested in
yeah.
the just to complete the flavor that you brought up earlier
Mm.
regarding what Smyrna represented, not just to the Greeks, but as an international city. And really, I want to sort of get your input into the Turkish reprisals against the population and the Great Fire of Smyrna.
Okay, well, I mean, what's good about this, because the book is essentially about the destruction of Smyrna, is that, I mean, there's paragraph after paragraph, there's several solid chapters about the destruction of it, but I've used my tabs here to actually find probably the most stark excerpts of the dealings, if I can read maybe a couple of them, because I think they do articulate best the events. But I'll keep it as trim as I can. If you want me to speed up, just let me know. Because it is
Just an overview. I mean, not so much detail as we've had so far, but just
okay.
as quickly as possible. But yes, thank
Okay.
you.
Okay. Well, I mean, I might just maybe do a couple of the most extreme ones, but okay, fine. Yeah, no. So essentially, what happens is that once the Greek forces are in disarray, I mean, I did say before that there wasn't really lines of resistance, but the Greeks do attempt at a couple of occasions, particularly on the approach to Smyrna, to sort of turn around and fight and stave off the Turkish forces. But the problem is that for the Greeks is that the Ottomans are in possession of a lot of cavalry. And so what actually tends to happen is that the Turks are constantly outflanking this broken Greek army that can't form a solid defensive line at any point. So at the moment the Greeks set up something resembling a defensive line, but say if it's along an escarpment or along a hill line or something, the Turks are outflanking the Greeks and the Greeks have to keep falling back. And it gets to the point where they're being encroached upon Smyrna proper. And I mean, we've outlined earlier in this conversation how prosperous and how sort of, I hate to use the word, but how cosmopolitan and sort of urbane Smyrna was as a city. And you've got these, I hate to use the word diversity, but you've got essentially a Greek quarter of Smyrna, you've got an Armenian quarter of Smyrna, you've got a Jewish quarter of Smyrna, you've got a Turkish quarter of Smyrna. I mean, quarter in the sense that the traditional usage, not a literal quarter, obviously. And then you've got these Levantine families. You know, you've got the American, and actually there's an American school, even an American college in Smyrna. There's a British educational facility at Smyrna as well. There's the British families, the French families, the Italian families, and they've all got actually a lot of assets. And these are families that have been residing in Smyrna for, well, especially in the British and French context, for centuries, and the Italians as well. And you have this Turkish army bearing down on Smyrna with just flames following them, and soot and ash in the wake of this Turkish army, who are, and it's fair to say that there are Greek forces who inflicted things on the Turkish population, like there were murders of Turkish civilians by Greek troops, and there were also the same done by Turkish troops on Greeks. So this is kind of like a case of increasing acrimony between the two forces, and sort of rivaling degrees of extremity in terms of reprisals upon the populations of whether they're Greeks or Turks who live in these areas. And ultimately the disaster can be sort of summarized as that although there's attempts by British diplomats and by, you know, American emissaries and some Greek elites in the area to sort of create a means of effective evacuation, one of the army, well, what the remnants of the Greek army from Smyrna, because you've got tens of thousands of survivors of this campaign who are trying to flee, more or less, and whose morale is totally broken. So basically the Greek priority firstly is to evacuate the army, which they mostly do with success. But then the other problem is that, like I said at the start of this segment of the stream, there was approximately 320,000 Greeks who lived in and around Smyrna. And these people were rightly terrified of what would happen to them. And it's revealed in this book here that when the initial sort of vanguard of the Turks arrive, it's not Ataturk himself. I can't remember who the general is, but there's actually this sort of calming influence that, yes, there won't be reprisals. Yes, we're not here to torch Smyrna. We'll agree to evacuations, etc. But then once the Turkish irregulars themselves arrive, they start torching the warehouses and the businesses and the homes and the villas of the wealthy Greek families, the Levantine families. It's just absolute ruin. And then eventually the non-Turkish population, so this includes the Greeks and the Armenians, make their way to the ocean front at Smyrna. And in the harbor is a plethora of allied ships. There's British ships, there's French ships, there's American ships, there's a handful of Italian ships, and there's also both Greek civilian ships and Greek naval vessels who are attempting the evacuation. And the great tragedy is that, and actually it is one thing I will source from this book, because it is referenced here in here a couple of times, is that due to not wanting to anger what would become the future Turkish government, the Americans are the most callous in this regard, but to some degree, the French and the British also declined to assist in the evacuation, utilizing their navies for not wanting to anger the nascent sort of Turkish forces and the Turkish state that will become. And the one of the starkest instances of what happens here is that actually the Greek metropolitan of Smyrna is beheaded by the Turks in the harbor front of Smyrna. And eventually thousands and thousands of Greeks are actually killed in the general massacre of the city. And every part of Smyrna is more or less put to the torch with the exception of the Turkish quarter. And it ends up being quite the catastrophe. If I can, like I said, I would like to perhaps touch on, because it's towards the end of the chapters here where it touches on the real severity of it here. Yeah, here we go. I've got a thing here, a source, or not a source, but a paragraph that's worth writing. Here we go. So Bristol was trying to think what was his name. So Bristol and Lovejoy are basically two, I think one's American, one's British, and they're attempting to facilitate some kind of an evacuation. And this sort of gets into the detail of their limited degrees of success, or in rather non-success, of this enterprise. But I'll read this end of the chapter here. Senior American officials spent the weekend trying to persuade the Greek government to send a fleet of vessels to rescue the crowds on the quayside before it was too late. But the Greeks would only agree to this if the safety of the ships would be guaranteed by the Turks. Such an assurance was not forthcoming. According to a telegram sent to Admiral Mark Bristol in Constantinople, Kemal said he would not take responsibility to allow Greek ships into the harbour. Quote, Bristol himself was coming under increasing pressure to send more vessels to Smyrna in order to speed up the humanitarian relief effort, yet he remained extremely reluctant to get involved, fearing that it would jeopardize American interests and potential future oil deals. His policy came under much criticism in Constantinople. The former consul general to Persia was so disgusted that he launched a stinging attack on Bristol in an interview for the New York Times. Quote, the United States, he said, cannot afford to have its fair name besmirched and befouled by allowing such a man to speak for the American soul and conscience, unquote. He informed the newspaper's readers how Bristol had once told him, quote, I hate the Greeks, I hate the Armenians, and I hate the Jews. The Turks are fine fellows, unquote. Although no American vessels pulled into the Bay of Smyrna that weekend, a few other ships made an appearance. Among them was a little freighter called the Dutch, which arrived on Sunday with a delivery of food and supplies for the American Relief Committee. It had been established against all the odds at the farthest end of the quayside. On board the Dutch was an American doctor by the name of Esther Lovejoy, who had volunteered to come to Smyrna in order to help with the relief effort. She had visited the city once before, in 1904, and had fond memories of the Edwardian charm. Now a rather different sight greeted her eyes. The destruction was complete, she wrote. Quote, the ruins somehow reminded me of trees I had seen at Ballywood, the site of the ferocious battle in France in 1918 between Allied and German forces, with all the branches shot away and desolation of the land before me, unquote. Lovejoy estimated there were still 300,000 refugees on the quayside, all of whom were in a terrible condition. Quote, the people squatting on the quay were filthy, she wrote. They had no means of keeping clean. They dared not go back into the ruins of the city for any purpose lest they lost their lives. In less than 2 weeks, the quay had become a reeking sewer in which the refugees sat and waited for deliverance. When the crowd stirred, the stench was beyond belief, unquote. Lovejoy realized the absolute urgency of getting these people off the quayside. Just 13 days remained before all who were still alive would be deported to the interior, and this, she knew, was considered by everyone to be a short life sentence of slavery under brutal masters, ended by mysterious death. If their lives were to be saved, it would be achieved only by a monumental effort. Although she could not do it by herself, she knew there was someone on hand to help. So this is that great controversy about how one of the things which even today in the Greek psyche, one of the great and rightfully so, sort of barbs that the Greeks have is that there's all these allied ships sitting in the harbor of Smyrna, and they're not protecting the city from Kemal's forces, but nor are they assisting with the evacuation. They're literally just sitting there. And there's actually instances whereby Greeks the strong ones attempt to swim out into the harbor and board their ships, and they're actually beaten off the ships by the sailors. It's a very, very deeply tragic event in history. Anything else you'd like to chime in there?
It doesn't surprise me at all, though, because what is the consistent thread throughout all of this? It's Western ambivalence towards both powers, ultimately. They are simply concerned with temporary marriages of convenience and power. And in this context, this is probably the most extreme example of this, despite the fact that I think it's fair to say that public sympathy, especially when we look at British public sympathy and French public sympathy towards the Greeks and the Greek War of Independence, was very much on the side of the Greeks, especially in light of the proposal of Mehmet Ali Pasha to essentially import a Egyptian population into the Peloponnese. We have that same situation with the American sympathy generally towards the Armenians. There is a discrepancy between realpolitik and, what extent public opinion is actually informing events on the ground. The international intervention in the Greek War of Independence, of course, had nothing to do with general sympathies, albeit politicians exploited them when they were convenient, as they exploited public sympathy towards the Greeks when it was convenient with the Treaty of Sèvres, and indeed the public sympathy towards the Armenians, and alas, it comes to nothing. Indeed, as we saw when I tried to outline that situation regarding the overstretched powers trying to impose all these peace treaties, they are very concerned, the French, the British, and the Americans, that any attempt at provoking the Turks, given the dramatic about turn for the Greeks, given where they were in 1921, now where they are at the end of 1922, would drive the Turkish Republic of course Marcos into the Soviet camp. The British and the French are now having to deal with the fact that the Soviet Union is an established power by 1922. And again, this will be the parallel conversation we have next time. So the Soviets have won the Russian Civil War. Now there is a possibility that the Turkish Republic will become communist because of the, you can say, the concerns over where the ideology of Kemalism is going. So there is every reason why the British and the French and the Americans would adopt this position. But of course, it is simply the most extreme example of this, again, only treating the Greeks as an extension of British foreign policy. Always. That has been the consistent, again, I hate to say this, consistent threat throughout all of this.
If I may use a modern vernacular in a crude way, a vassal state of the GAAE, for purposes of foreign policy.
Yes, it was very convenient for the British to use the Greeks as a proxy to impose the Treaty of Sèvres without the British having to commit themselves. But now they have exhausted that possibility. They're going to stab them in the back. Yeah, just to explain what's going on here. But also, again, finding parallels. When we see the beheading of the Metropolitan of Smyrna, the same thing happens with the execution of the ecumenical patriarch, with the Greek Revolution. All of these things, and the pogroms against the Greeks, all of these things are repeating themselves. And as this process began 100 years before, now we're seeing the end of the Greco-Turkish War with the culmination of this. And even though Venizelos is out of power, he's a figure who pops up consistently throughout from 1910 up until 1936, he is consistently the prime minister, and prime minister at a time of disillusion in terms of the Greek political system, as we have radical Republicans who are sympathetic towards the Megali idea, and monarchists surrounding a increasingly unpopular monarchy, especially under King George II. So in the context of what's happening now, the project of Kemal is to create an Anatolian Turkish state. The project now for the Greeks is to mitigate the losses after the disaster of Smyrna, and by extension, limit pogroms and massacres which have been directed towards the Greek population, as we saw with the Armenian genocide. This is very much at the forefront of Greek policymaking. So
Indeed. Well, just going to say, just before we move on, because this is about Smyrna, and Smyrna, it's as much as it is a sacking, there's also the Great Fire of Smyrna. Just I couldn't find it from before. I have one paragraph that describes the scale of the fire. May I just, because that's my last reference point. Because once we move on from here, it won't be particularly relevant. The Smyrna quayside had indeed become a scene of abject human misery, almost 2 miles long, and wider than a football pitch. It was large enough to accommodate hundreds of thousands of homeless people. The transformation into a makeshift refugee camp had been rapid and dramatic. Just a few days earlier, the waterfront had been alive to the sound of gypsy orchestras and brass bands. Now the gaiety had been totally replaced by rank squalor and fear. The same people who had only recently spent their evenings sauntering up and down in the evening finery were now camped out in the open with neither privacy nor provisions. Now, this is about half a week prior to the other source I read, because I had to go back. Sorry. By the time dusk fell on that terrible Wednesday, the quayside was crowded with almost 500,000 refugees and escaping soldiers. They stood in real danger of being burnt alive by the fire had by now reached the waterfront, a scalding, pulsating heat that was transmitted from building to building by the liberal use of benzene. The Théâtre des Smyrnes had erupted into flame shortly after the American nationals had been evacuated. Just minutes later, the American consulate had burst into a wall of fire. George Horton had left in the nick of time with his staff. He managed to save the consulate archives, but his cherished library was devoured by the flames. The heat was soon so intense that the mooring lines of the ships closest to the waterfront began to burn. All the vessels moved 250 yards out from the quayside, yet the heat was still overwhelming even for the sailors. The flames leapt higher and higher, wrote Oran Rabur, a tourist who had arrived in Smyrna just a few days earlier. The screams of the frantic mob on the quay could be easily heard a mile distant. There was a choice of three kinds of death: the fire behind, the Turks waiting at the side streets, or the ocean in front. In modern chronicles, there had probably been nothing to compare with the night of September 13 in Smyrna. So I just wanted to get that last summary in, because that really does describe the terror and also the extent of the burning of the city. You know, this is a case of where probably 70 to 80% of the city is burnt, and there's hundreds of thousands of people trying to huddle and escape. And I mean, one might say, yes, the Greek government got what was coming and they got themselves into a situation they shouldn't have done, but the extent of the human tragedy of the sacking and burning of Smyrna cannot be understated. So thank you for the last point in.
Well, again, I mean, obviously there have been massacres committed by both parties, and in terms of a similar disaster, one has to look at the decimation of Chios during the Greek War of Independence. I mean, there are many things going on here. First of all, this is a complete rebuke of the treaty imposed by the Entente, and the Entente cowering before Mustafa Kemal's fait accompli, which is established here, and a desperate desire to ensure not Turkish allegiance, but just Turkish neutrality vis-a-vis the Soviet Union. Now, what Ataturk achieves here, therefore, is really quite incredible in terms of being able to not just destroy the Greeks, which are the Entente powers' proxy, compel the Entente to totally disavow their proxy, but achieve a significant and by extension multi-ethnic territory for the new Turkish Republic. As you can see, the projected aspects of a Kurdish nation state are now reincorporated firmly back into Turkey, which
they're deleted outright, if you think about it.
Yes, and that's the basis for the situation of the Turk relations with the Kurds. Armenia, as you can see, not only is Armenia effectively deleted when the rump of Armenia around Yerevan is reincorporated into the Soviet Union, but the Turks actually gain territory in the east, the territory that Enver Pasha had wanted to reincorporate via Sarıkamış, the area around Kars that was lost in 1878. So not only, again, has Turkey held, but Turkey has actually expanded in some ways. The zone of the Straits has now been restricted to the Straits proper regarding Constantinople and the Dardanelles. And this area, which has limited Turkish sovereignty, will, during the lifetime of Mustafa Kemal Ataturk, be returned to full Turkish sovereignty. So Ataturk essentially achieves all of his foreign policy goals, and he's able to establish Turkey as a new power. So whilst we see the decimation of the Greek population, one has to look at essentially what's happening with the political situation of Turkey as well. Because as I said, the trajectory that we start on in 1821 is the creation of two opposing nations, where once there had existed one empire. From the Ottoman Empire in the military realm, now we have a Turkey and now we have a Greece. In 1922, the Ankara government, victorious, forces the last sultan into exile. As a compromise, the Ottoman dynasty is represented by a Halif from 1922 until 1924. But again, by the same logic of the British wanting to maintain a sultan and the desire essentially for Kemal to oversee this secularist revolution in Turkey, the Caliphate is ultimately abolished as well. So all of these vestiges linking back to this Islamic Caesarean conception of the Roman nation, with the ecumenical patriarch under it, is effectively deleted by the Turkish Republic. Now, in terms of the seismic ethnic connotations of this, as you've already mentioned, the situation in Smyrna is a microcosm for the potentialities of a genocide directed against the Greeks, as we saw with the Armenians.
Mm-hmm.
Understanding the potential severity of this, but also wanting to recognize the refugee crisis, which is already developed by 1923, where you see the ratification of the Treaty of
in real
Lausanne.
time with the collapse of the campaign.
It
You
is,
know,
but not just. I'm not just talking about Smyrna. I'm talking about everywhere throughout Greece,
indeed, yes,
everywhere
yes,
from
yes.
Pontus
Through
to Greek
Cappadocia,
Thrace,
through
through
Cilicia,
Cappadocia,
the whole lot.
everywhere.
Yeah.
I mean, this.
Yeah.
Again, full disclosure, I found this map on Reddit, but I think I seldom found a map that was actually useful in terms of being able to demonstrate
From
the
my
various
knowledge, that's probably
populations.
not too far from the truth, I'd
But
say.
this is
That seems about
but
right.
this is why I selected this map,
Yeah.
because I felt of all of them, the color schemes weren't actually very useful. But of course, this map is interesting because it displays the Turkish resettlement, but also the areas that weren't resettled, such as in Constantinople, Eastern Thrace, and indeed parts of Pontus. But as you
Yeah.
can see,
Yeah.
the significant Greek populations are almost entirely resettled, both in European as well as Asian, the Turkish Republic. And as you can see, there is actually some benefit from the Greeks here, in the sense that they were able to conduct this as a population transfer, not simply a population removal, as we saw with the Germans. Say, for example, in the aftermath of the Second World War, the Greek state is able to purify itself effectively in terms of its ethnic connotations and also religious connotations, because religion is a far more reliable factor in these transfers than rigid ethnicity. So
Which is why, for instance, just for the sake of that point, sorry, AM, which is why, for instance, you actually see Greek citizens today with Turkish surnames, particularly if you see Greek with the surname Oglu, right? That's a Turkish suffix to a name,
yeah,
but they would have been Christianized Turcopoles and hence would have been considered liable to have remained in Greek as Greek citizens on the basis of religion, and hence why the Greeks who converted to Islam in Pontus, which they were given the choice to, and many were already Muslim as well. That's why you have this Greek minority remnant in Pontus, because they converted to Islam, as an
yeah,
example.
yeah. And thank you for that clarification. This population transfer is huge. We're talking about 1.2 million Greeks and 400,000 Turks. So the irony of all of this is that if we're looking at some conception like Hyman's Reich when it comes to Germany, the Greeks finally achieve an ethno-state for all Greeks, albeit it's within this truncated territory and in the aftermath of the humiliation of Smyrna and this
Yeah.
international stab in the back. For the
In the
Turks,
context of
yeah,
losing a war, you might say that, you know how with the German question there was the case of the Grossdeutschland and Kleine Deutschland. Eventually, the North German Confederation formed Kleine Deutschland, like smaller United Germany. You might sort of argue this like the Kleine Megali idea, but like an ethno state, but in a truncated Greece, not a greater Greece.
I wouldn't say that comparison is necessarily accurate. I think this is
I'm not saying
more.
it's accurate.
No, I would say this is more resembling what happened to the Germans between 1945 and 1949 in
Yeah, the
what
expulsion of
used to
the
be
Ostdeutsch. Yeah.
what used to be
Mm,
Silesia
mm,
and
mm.
Pomerania and East Prussia.
Yeah.
A
I was saying
truncate,
that
yeah,
I was saying that more in terms of like Magali idea was kind of that same idea of Grossdeutschland, like the incorporation of the ethno state as at its maximal extent with all the Greeks or all the Germans in one state, but both never came to fruition. You know, that's more what
yes,
I meant.
the false dawn of Greater Greece results in
Mm,
the forced removal of the Greek populations to this truncated version of Greece, which, of course, most notably doesn't include Smyrna, but doesn't include Constantinople either. Whereas the Turks are
mm,
left with the rump of this imperial project, which, of course, is larger than the actual ethnic core of Turks within Anatolia itself. So the Turks obviously have the advantage of this. But just to summarize, this is the end of the nation of Rome. This is the end of the Ottoman Empire. And this is the end of any serious pretensions that the Greeks can feasibly have over Constantinople and over Anatolia. The only real sort of exception to this, I mean, I don't want to get into later history, but just as an epilogue, is of course the Dodecanese Islands, which are ceded to Greece after the Second World
Mm-hmm.
War, when the Italians, of
Mm.
course, join it with the Germans. And then, of course, there is the question of Ionosis regarding the situation in Cyprus, which, of course, was under British control at this time. Now, what happened in Cyprus is that even though the Greek dictatorship during the colonel's dictatorship during the 1970s was determined to achieve Ionosis, and indeed they launched a coup against the Cypriot government, which was effectively independent at that point. The colonel's coup, rather than facilitate Ionosis, instead precipitated the Turkish invasion. And since then, there has been a Turkish Republic and a Greek Republic. So even in terms of the limited gains of the restitution of the Greek populations in Cyprus, that has not been achieved either,
Mm.
because both states, even though Turkey is the only one to recognize the North Turkish Republic, that state remains, the southern Cypriot state remains independent from the rest of Greece.
Indeed, and it's worth mentioning on that note, just very briefly, that the only sizable ethnic minority that really exists in the Turkish Republic today is the Kurds in the east. All the other minorities which exist in Anatolia, and indeed in the other fringe parts of the Ottoman Empire prior to this period, have either been victims of massacre or have been expelled in this population exchange. And like as you say, this brings about the creation of this Turkish ethno-state in Anatolia predominantly.
So I think hopefully we've illustrated why this would be a logical endpoint for discussing the fate around the Second Rome and Constantinople and the division, and you can say the end of the concept of the Orthodox Commonwealth within this state, also in relation to the other states which have forged their own independent paths, like Bulgaria, like Yugoslavia, like Romania, and now, of course, Albania. So obviously, this is going to be facilitated by a parallel conversation when I talk about what happened with the Soviet Union. Of course, I have talked about the fact that the way that Turkey almost became an international necessity 3 years after the Treaty of Sèvres, as bizarre as that may seem to people looking casually at this, the one international factor which had decisively shaped the view of the Entente powers regarding the fait accompli presented by Ataturk was, of course, the situation in the Soviet Union and the idea of Turkey being an ally of the Soviet Union and threatening the entire Entente establishment in the Balkans and the Middle East. So I'm just going to look at the super chats and then we can get out of here. Josephina Herevega just says Happy Wagner Day. Okay, this is in reference to Nationhood's organization of a Wagner Day this morning. Richard Wagner, of course. This morning, I put out a biography of Richard Wagner as my limited contribution to this project. So people want to check out, and indeed all of the contributions made to Richard Wagner Day, that would be very much appreciated. Polish ambassador for, I forget what the currency of Poland is, or 10, whatever that is. Can't watch now, we'll watch later. Cheers. Well, thank you very much, Polish ambassador. Zachary Bulduk for 22 Canadian dollars. Thank you very much. I have little to add to this topic, but this donation is long overdue. Thank you very much for your lectures, Am. Well, that's very much appreciated, Zachary. Thank you so much. Annie for $10. When you say Great Britain had control over certain areas, do you mean the Crown or the City of London? I get confused during this period and can't discern one from the other. I don't really understand what you mean by the differentiation between the Crown or the City of London. The City of London doesn't have a sovereign. I mean, that's sort of debatable concerning the City of London itself, but in terms of being able to project power outside, we're only talking about informal influence regarding the City of London, and we're also not talking about various trading powers as well, like the East India Trading Company. This really isn't applicable here. When we're talking about international concessions and extraterritoriality, these are confirmed by treaties conducted with these quote-unquote sovereign powers and the British government, and I believe administered by the Colonial Office. If you're summarizing the Crown as representing the British government, Her Majesty's government, or His Majesty's government during this time, in the early 20th century, then I hope that's answered your question. If I probably misunderstood it, but anyway, Juan Quigaron for $10. What is the contemporary Turkish outlook on the greater Greek question, especially regarding the Megali idea? The contemporary Turkish outlook is outright contempt and rarely any consideration, because the Greeks don't have any sort of claim, because there is no significant ethnicity there, as we discussed. And indeed, the Greco-Turkish animosity does in some ways continue up until this day. I'm not quite... Yeah.
I was going to say, it's probably worth saying too that the Turks feel, at least my perception is that the Turks feel a sense of relief that they skewered the idea basically permanently now, and that their sense of sovereignty over Eastern Thrace and Anatolia basically is unquestioned now, whereas up until this point, up until the Greco-Turkish War of the early 20s, that was always brought into question, because as we see on these various maps, we demonstrated that, whether we're talking about Pontus, whether we're talking about Eastern Thrace, whether you're talking about even Ionia and that Aegean coastline, there were significant pockets of Greek populations. In some places, Turks were minority; in other places, Greeks were minority. And as wars in this time period were based upon such claims, these events that we're witnessing with the population exchange, the aftermath of the war, have put that all to bed. And for the Turks, it's a how can I put this? I use the word relief, but for them, their place in their part of the world is now sort of unchallengeable, insofar that the lands that they possess are theirs, and without any challenge by the Greek state or otherwise, and it's incontestable.
Moshansky for is that Swedish krona? Thank you for the wonderful 50 of those. Thank you very much. Thank you for the wonderful stream. Are there any descendants of the old Illyrian language still alive today, other than possibly Albanian? Well, that's not really relevant to the stream. I mean, there is debate as to whether Albanian is the residue of the old Illyrian languages. I mean, the only sort of Illyrianism is sort of interesting, because we're talking about continuity theories before the Slavic migrations into this area during the late 6th and early 7th centuries. Of course, there is the Illyrian continuity theory when it comes to the possibility of the Albanian language, even though the Albanian language, even though it's not Slavic, really sort of only comes into existence around the time of Skanderbeg. And when we look at Romanian, of course, there is the Dacio-Romanian theory, the idea that Romanians are either the descendants of Roman colonists, of Dacians, or a combination of both. And of course, there is the theory moving on from that actually no, it is a mainly Slavic strata, which interbred with the Kuman Kipchaks and other populations like that. I believe when it comes to Romanians, it's a fusion of all of these. That's the most sort of cowardly position to take. Nevertheless, I think there is an element of truth to that, especially regarding the nomenclature around political offices. I mean, I mentioned Hospodar, Gospodar, even though that was relating to the Danubian principalities, what later become Romania. That, of course, is a Slavic title, and for good reason, in addition to the fact that the Wallachians had boyars. But again, that's tangential to your point. I'm not qualified to answer that question. All I'll point... Yeah.
So sorry, no, finish it. I'll come in after you. What are you going to say?
All I will say is that there are vestiges of Albanian dialects in Kosovo, in Macedonia, in Italy, and indeed in Attica in Greece. But anyway, Marcus, what were you going to say?
I was just going to say that from what I understand on the subject, I mean, like Am says, it's not really relevant to this point, but to answer the super chat, I believe in the Venetian holdings in the Adriatic in the sort of 16th, 17th century, we see the last vestiges of what you could call classical Illyrian, or like variations of it having intermingled with Slavic languages. the last vestiges of it die out, sort of, prior to or just on the onset of the Enlightenment. And I think it's a stretch to say that if it's considered that the eventual death of these languages, or rather derivatives of the Illyrian language, have died out then, does it exist now? Probably. I think it's a stretch to say no now. Whether it lives on to some degree in Albanian, I don't know. I'm not a linguist, neither is AM, but I mean, the general consensus is that Illyrian in its most derivative form existed up until the sort of 1700s, but no one speaks it, so it's been essentially a dead language. I think that's the good conclusion we can draw.
And another sort of interesting point to consider regarding what was brought up earlier in the stream is the Aromanian connection, which again is a substrata of this idea of the Dacian Roman continuity theory. But of course, this is the parallel to Illyrianism, not Illyrianism itself. And of course, regarding interesting extinct languages which reach their terminus really in terms of any sizable numbers in the 15th century, but continue, as you mentioned, until about the 17th century, is of course Gothic German, the last sort of vestige of the Eastern Germanic group in Crimea at this time. But anyway, that's another tangent. Jacob Brown
Indeed.
for $5 just sends $5, so thank you very much. Marcus 588 for $8 Australian, thank you very much. Wonderful stream as always, guys. Furious, so this is directed to you. Aside from Smyrna, what were the great losers to the Greek nation people?
I got a feeling that that's losses, not losers. Might be just a typo. Okay. So, well, Smyrna itself, obviously. I mean, if you look at the population statistics of the time, Smyrna was twice as big as Athens, and arguably, had they actually kept Smyrna, Smyrna would have probably been a more fitting capital than Athens, because the reason why Athens grew so suddenly, leading up to World War II, is because it had to make room for the refugees that fled from Anatolia. There's actually suburbs around Athens, basically. If you look on a map, you'll see, Nea Smyrna, Nea Philadelphia, Nea, all these places that they had to evacuate in, Nea Sinassos, the place that they evacuated in Anatolia, and then established suburbs, predominantly in Athens and even in Thessaloniki to some extent, as a result. But to answer the sub chat specifically, I think obviously it's hard to say, not to say Constantinople, because if things had transpired a certain way, it's probably likely that at least some of, if not the entirety of the Straits, that sort of international Straits regime. I suppose if it was led by a caliph, that would be different, or like some kind of residual element of the Ottoman regime, perhaps a different story. But one way or another, it is likely that Constantinople probably and Eastern Thrace would have been incorporated into Greece, sort of for the most part, if not in its entirety. And on that basis, too, Adrianople / Edirne, that was also, you look at on this map here, particularly see that part of the Dardanelles. I mean, we sort of think, the Allied troops attacked the Dardanelles in 1915 as part of the Ottoman Empire. But you look at these places, Sestos, Salimbria, these are all Byzantine and Greek cities, had Greek majority populations, and that was true up until this, prior to the population exchanges. Another one, the next two that probably stick out.
Sorry, before you move on, Marcus, can I just elaborate on that point you brought up?
Sure, of course.
Obviously, the point I emphasize is that had the Greeks been able to defeat the nascent Turkish Republic, and had the Greeks, say, for example, solidified their position in northwestern Anatolia, that the regime of the Straits would have crumbled towards Greek pressure in the long term, as we saw the remilitarization of the Straits under Turkey in the 1930s. So the interesting of Constantinople becomes very interesting, and I do think there is a possibility that several decades down the road, that Constantinople, the British would have acquiesced and allowed parts of Constantinople to be reincorporated into a Hellenic state, in which case it is likely that it would have served as the capital, owing to the rather meager status of Athens, and due to the obvious neoclassical sort of ideas which the capital in Athens had to lean on, which of course become increasingly irrelevant. regarding the Ottomans in the situation, I think had the Ottoman administration in Constantinople been separated from the administration in Anatolia, as we see, and I think in any other scenario would have probably played out the same, just not with the same radical implications as we saw with Kemalism, I think it is possible that the caliphate would have continued to exist in a situation that we saw with Vatican City and the Lateran Treaty in the 1920s. It's possible that, say, for example, the region around Dolmabahce could have been carved out as a new caliphal Vatican City, if that makes sense. I mean, obviously the
Yeah.
Greeks would want Fatih district to remain part of the Greek nation. And I think Dolmabahce, rather than focusing on Topkapi Palace, would have been an interesting compromise to see as to what extent this territory of a caliphal Vatican would have essentially existed.
Indeed.
But it's an interesting question. I think that's the most likely outcome. But yes, sorry,
And
continue with your points.
and the Dolmabahce Palace would have been a logical place too, because that's on the Galata side of the Golden Horn as well, and it could have been feasible. There could have been, say, like a caliph part of the city, in much the way there's sort of, if you look at like a map of Rome, Castel Sant'Angelo sits on one side of the Tiber and is sort of separate from the west of Rome that sort of traverses southeast of the River Tiber, well, certainly the old part of the city, and indeed that would have been like a physical separation, because obviously the Golden Horn would separate the Galata from the Fatia district and the Phaneroles district that sort of sits astride on the south side of the Golden Horn. But to answer the rest of the question briefly, there's this population of Greeks in Cappadocia, which again, like much of the Hellenic population of Anatolia, had been there for millennia. And there's certain elements of that Greek community that actually spoke Turkish but wrote it with a Greek alphabet, and that has been lost. Well, no one actively speaks it anymore. Like, I mean, they know what it is linguistically. We have, writings, and we have inscriptions, and we have, the knowledge of the language, but no one actively speaks, and that's a tragedy. And just on that map that AM just took away, you have this very extensive population of Greeks on the Black Sea coast. Places like, and I said them before: Sinope, Samsun, Kerasun, Trapezoid. And again, this is the part of the Byzantine realm, or parts of it at least, that outlived the fall of Constantinople itself. The Empire of Trebizond wasn't extinguished until 1461 under the Megas Komnenoi, and indeed being the last holdout territory of the empire against the rising Ottoman sort of empire, as it were, is it sort of the tragedy that these people here, they tried to create a republic in that sort of early 1920s period. But again, like all these Greek adventures in Anatolia, come to nothing. And the Greeks there either convert and remain in Turkey and become sort of Turkish, or like this sort of Greco-Turkish hybrid in Anatolia, become Islamified. Or again, like all the other Greeks, they're shipped across to this truncated Greek state on the western side of the Aegean. And I think those are the great losses in that sense. And I think it's just this overarching tragedy. As someone who has a classical orientation, as I do, you sort of have this long reaching idea of people and what is ethnogenesis, and that ethnogenesis, what is their connection to land or to territory, to places. And you can look at a map of Anatolia from the period of the Wars of the Diadochi, or from the Roman Republic, and these names actually sort of continue as place names for Greek speakers in Anatolia up until more or less the modern day, right up until World War One. It's interesting that even though you have the Ottoman Empire, they still call Smyrna Smyrna, they still call Constantinople Constantinople. It's only when Ataturk, I can't remember what year it was, I think it was like 24, 25, maybe 28, can't remember, but the Turks passed what they call, I think, the postage law, the Turkish postage law, by which they will not refer to any of these cities other than their Turkish name. And then that's where you sort of see Izmir comes into parlance, and Istanbul comes into parlance, and these last vestiges of Greek references, or indeed Roman to some degree references of these places, vanish into history. And that's sort of just sad from a perennial point of view.
Lord Kelvin for $20. Thank you very much. Excellent stream, gentlemen. What would you say was the biggest missed opportunity on the part of the Greeks throughout this period? Well, I think what we've actually outlined extensively during this is that the Greeks had very little in the way of opportunities to seize the initiative. And when they were given an opportunity to quote unquote seize the initiative in the Greco-Turkish War, it was very much with the acquiescence of foreign powers. And as we saw, once the Greeks stopped being useful to these foreign powers, the Greeks were dropped in the most dramatic and barbarous way possible. In the same way that the international powers and during the Greek War of Independence were invested in keeping the Ottoman Empire alive up until about 1826. Then the Ottomans were dropped and they went around to support the Greeks. So you can say the Western powers, in some ways, in terms of propping up the Ottoman Empire, delayed this process. We're outlining this teleology, even though I I push back against this idea of using teleology as a guiding sort of force in history, but this idea of the consistent animosity and from the point of view of the Ottomans, the national betrayal of the Greeks, there is a through arc, obviously, which I'm calling here the Greco-Turkish 100 Years' War, which ends here rather interestingly based on the themes which were established in 1821. But foreign powers at various intervals prevented the acceleration of these ethnic atrocities committed against one another. And in some ways, indeed, they facilitated them. But I see very little opportunity for Greek independent action. Even before the Greek War of Independence, when we look at the Greek plan and the first Crimean War of 1768 to 1774, the Greeks were an extension of the powers, the foreign policies of various other nations, in the same way that when we see the Greek insurgents, the Maniots resisting the forces of the Egyptians in the 1820s, all of these things are contingent on foreign policy interventions. I think in the example of Greece, it really is one of the most extreme instances of this idea in history.
Absolutely, it's definitely. And you say about the Greek plan is a perfect example of that. How it's sort of these foreign plans and foreign ideas that's either A, imposed upon Greece, or B, the Greeks are used as a vehicle to fulfill the plans and the sort of strategic vision of, be it the Austrians or the Russians, or in the case later where sort of Greece becomes this plaything between the French and the British. They're an extension of Anglo-French foreign policy and sort of strategic thinking, rather than, what are the Greek people determining for themselves as sort of like a fulfilling of a manifest dynasty of some, manifest destiny of some kind. The only real attempt at this is probably, although Venizelos is acting sort of on the behest of the Entente anyway, but it's the fact that it is essentially a Greek operation and a Greek idea that's being fulfilled by Greeks. It's the one roll the dice that they attempt really of their own accord, and they lose. As per the question itself, I've got two very brief answers. One, and that is, had Capodistrias lived, he'd been able to galvanize a Greek elite around him. The history of Greece in that context, certainly in its early years as a nascent independent state, could have been different as well. And they would have been less at the behest of the French and the British, but I guess we'll never know. And B is, I primarily discussed that time period where the Greeks advance into Anatolia. They score victories against the Turks in sort of the summer of 21. And had they fulfilled, or had they chosen the other way where they had dug in on the frontier and protected their holdings and actually scored, or as a result of these victories against the Turks and as a result of the occupation of Anatolia, would have been able to have scored a favorable outcome, even if there was a slight revision of Severus, it would have been much more to the Greek advantage, broadly speaking. And the second thing is that it's just, in the context of the monkey bite, the election, a lot of misfortune just happens at this one point in time that just has grave consequences thereafter. But again, my answer to that question, the latter part, is definitely, if you could go back and hindsight's 2020, the Greeks ought to have dug in and actually held the ground. And you could argue that, they sort of fell into the same trap that Napoleon did, to some degree, the same trap that the Germans would do in Russia in 41, like Operation Typhoon, push into Moscow. Sometimes you push that a little bit further and it breaks you. And I believe the Greeks attempted that by trying to push on Ankara in the second part of that offensive that ultimately broke them. So they're my two answers to that question.
Juan Sibley for $5. Thank you very much. Your streams, knowledge, and the dynamic between you, Pertinax and Columba have made me fall back in love with history all over again. Thank you all. Well, if that really is the case, then I'm very grateful for that. To sort of stimulate any sort of interest in any sort of period in time, but in history in general, and the idea that we are responsible for that is a great honor to behold. I'm sorry that Columba can't be here. Of course, Columba was here for the discussion, the Greek War of Independence, but Columba is taking a general hiatus from streams, unfortunately. All right.
And we very much miss his presence, but indeed, I just want to reiterate, AM, we thank you for the comment, and indeed, if we can perform a small service in that regard, AM, I'm sure you agree, we are glad, no matter how small that impact may be. We both have a passion for history, and we're glad to share it with everyone. And the fact that we gain a great, well, I certainly attain a joy from this, even though it completely shreds my my sleeping schedule. I'm very honored, and of course, this all started when you kindly invited me onto a stream when you started the Charlemagne series, and here we are, many streams later. But I've enjoyed every moment of it. So, just to thank you and your audience once again, you've been all very good and gracious to me.
Thank you very much for those kind words, Marcus. All right, well, that is the end of this stream. Just to say that orthodoxy, autocracy, and nationality will conclude when we look at the parallel Russian situation and the fall, not only of the Tsar, not only of the provisional government, but of course of the white forces as well, which again, it fits very neatly into this in terms of the denied rush towards the Second Rome, Constantinople, and the fall of the Third Rome, Moscow, to the forces of the Bolsheviks, later Soviet Union. So that will hopefully be on Wednesday night, so join us again for that conversation. Before we go though, Marcus, is there anything you would like to share?
Well, aside from us streaming on Wednesday, which will be the bookend, the end to this series, which has been a fantastic series, I myself will be streaming with Hitman this coming Saturday, I'm pretty sure, and we'll be talking about the Paul Emil von Lettow-Vorbeck's My Reminiscences of East Africa, which summarizes the German colonial campaign in East Africa in World War One. And that is an aside. I don't think I have anything coming up immediately. So, yeah, just looking forward to more of what we've got installed. But yeah, no, it's good that OAN is getting a nice finish. And like you say, to end on Greece and Russia is a fitting bookend. And it's good to get here. It closes a nice chapter to your great, well, to our work, but to your great work, as you've planned all this, and it's been another fantastic series. So thank you, AM. I've much appreciated all of this.
All right. So thank you to everyone who has sent super chats. Thank you again to Marcus for all his wonderful comments, but also for his contributions to this stream and indeed to the series as a whole and all of the work on this channel. Thank you, everyone, for listening, and good night.
Goodbye, everyone.